Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into one of the strangest chapters of human history, a time when the wrong shirt could bankrupt you, the wrong shoes could get you arrested, and the wrong colour could quite literally end your life. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning getting dressed for work, and before you even reach the coffee shop, you're stopped by officials, fined thousands of dollars, and your favourite jacket is ripped right off your body in the middle of the street. Sounds insane, right? Well, during the Renaissance, this wasn't a dystopian nightmare. This was Tuesday. Welcome to the era when fashion police were real and they weren't playing around. So before we dive into this unbelievable story together, I want to ask you something. If you enjoy what you're about to hear, would you mind giving this video a like? Maybe hit that subscribe button if you want more stories like this one, and I'd genuinely love to know, where are you right now as you're listening to this? Are you in bed on a night drive, or maybe folding laundry at 2 a.m? Drop a comment and let me know. There's something beautiful about all of us scattered across the world sharing this same moment in time. Alright, get comfortable. Dim those lights if you can. Maybe turn on a fan or open a window for that gentle background hum. Let's step back 500 years together and meet a man who just wanted to look good. It's September the 15th, 1595. The sun is setting over Genoa, Italy, painting the harbour in shades of gold and amber. The streets are alive with merchants closing their shops, children playing their last games before dinner. And somewhere in this beautiful chaos, there's a man named Salvaggio d'Asti. Now, Salvaggio isn't a criminal in the way we think of criminals today. He hasn't stolen anything, he hasn't hurt anyone. But as he walks down the Via San Lorenzo, dressed in his finest clothes, he's about to be arrested. Again. See, Salvaggio has a problem. He loves fashion, absolutely loves it. And in 1595 Genoa, that love is going to cost him. Because what Salvaggio is wearing right now, a beautiful black silk doublet with delicate silver embroidery at the sleeves, the kind of outfit that catches the light just right and makes you feel like the most confident version of yourself, is illegal. Yes, illegal. Not inappropriate. Not against dress code. Illegal. As in, there are actual government officials whose entire job is to walk around the city looking for people dressed too well. And they've spotted Salvaggio. The records from Genoa's state archives describe exactly what happened next. 2 sumptuary magistrates approach him. They note every detail of his outfit with the precision of crime scene investigators. The black silk taffeta, the metallic stitching along the collar, the way his sleeves are cut just a bit too fashionably. They write it all down. And then they fine him. Now here's the thing that makes Salvaggio's story so fascinating. This isn't his first time. It's not even his second or third. By the time the records stop tracking him, Salvaggio d'Asti has been caught and fined for illegal fashion. 5 separate times. 5 times. And yet he keeps wearing these forbidden clothes. Why? Because to Salvaggio and to thousands of people like him across Renaissance Europe, what you wore wasn't just about looking good. It was about who you were, your identity, your dignity, your very self. And the government knew that, which is exactly why they tried so hard to control it. Let me paint you a picture of what life was actually like under these laws, because I think we often imagine the Renaissance as this beautiful, artistic, free-spirited time. Leonardo painting the Mona Lisa, Michelangelo sculpting David, Shakespeare writing poetry, and yes, all of that was happening. But it was also happening in a world where what you wore to breakfast could determine whether you'd make it to lunch as a free person. These weren't vague guidelines or social suggestions. These were actual laws called sumptuary laws, from the Latin word meaning expenditure. They were legal codes written down, updated constantly, and enforced with shocking dedication. And they regulated everything. I mean everything. The type of fabric you could wear, the colours you could use, how many buttons your jacket could have, the length of your sleeves, the height of your collar, Whether you could wear fur, and if so, what kind of fur, how many rings on your fingers, the material of your belt, the style of your shoes. In Florence alone, between 1300 and 1500, the city government revised these fashion laws 80 times. 80 times in 200 years. That's a new set of clothing regulations every 2.5 years on average. Can you imagine, just when you finally understand what you're allowed to wear, they change the rules again? And these laws existed everywhere, thousands of them across Europe. In Germany alone, historians have found thousands of surviving sumptuary law documents. England had them, France had them, Spain had them, Italy had them everywhere, Florence, Venice, Siena, Bologna, Genoa, Milan, Rome. Every city-state had its own complex system of fashion control. But why would governments spend so much time, energy and resources telling people what to wear? The official reason they gave was always about morality and economics. They said luxury was sinful, that people were spending too much money on clothes instead of important things, that foreign imports were hurting domestic craftsmen. And sure, there was some truth to that. But let's be honest about what was really happening here. It was about power. It was about keeping people in their place. See, Renaissance Europe was obsessed with social hierarchy. You had royalty at the very top, then nobility, then clergy, then wealthy merchants and professionals, then skilled craftsmen, then labourers, then servants, then peasants at the bottom, and everyone was supposed to stay in their lane, not just metaphorically, literally. Where you could live, what jobs you could do, who you could marry, and absolutely what you could wear. Because here's the thing that terrified the upper classes: clothing is visible. Unlike your bank account or your family tree or your education, what you're wearing is something everyone can see immediately. It's a walking, breathing advertisement of who you are and what you can afford. And during the Renaissance, something scary was happening to that hierarchy. Merchants were getting rich, really rich. The commercial revolution was in full swing, trade routes were expanding, banking was booming, and suddenly you had middle-class families who could actually afford silk, who could buy velvet, who had enough money for gold embroidery and imported lace and all those things that used to be exclusively for the nobility. And the nobles, they were furious. Because if everyone can wear silk, what makes a noble special? If a merchant's daughter shows up to church in the same quality dress as a duchess, how do you tell them apart? The whole visible structure of society was threatened, so they made it illegal. Let me tell you how the enforcement actually worked, because this is where it gets truly dystopian. In Florence, they had special officials called the Ufficiali dell'Onesta. Their job was to patrol the city and catch fashion criminals. They'd position themselves at strategic locations outside the Duomo Cathedral in the Piazza della Signoria, at market entrances, at tavern doors, anywhere people gathered, and they'd just watch people walking by, scanning their outfits for violations. If they saw something illegal, a woman wearing pearls, she wasn't entitled to a man with silver buttons above his station they'd approach. Sometimes they'd be polite about it and just issue a fine. But other times, the records describe officers literally ripping jewellery off women's necks and arms. Imagine that. You're walking to church on Sunday morning and a government official grabs your necklace and yanks it off right there on the street because your social class doesn't have permission to wear it. The fines were no joke either. They were calculated to hurt. In Florence, if you were caught wearing illegal clothing, you'd pay a significant fine, sometimes deducted directly from your dowry if you were a woman, which could ruin your marriage prospects. The person who made the garment, your tailor or dressmaker, would be fined even more, and in some cases both you and your tailor could face imprisonment. But wait, it gets weirder. In Siena, they created what might be the most paranoid enforcement system in history. They set up a wooden box on the wall of the Palazzo Pubblico, the town hall, and they invited citizens to anonymously report fashion violations. Anyone over 20 years old could write down the name of someone they'd seen breaking the clothing laws, describe what illegal item they were wearing where they saw them, what time of day it was, fold up that little piece of paper and drop it in the box. Secret police by the people for the people. Your neighbour could turn you in, your rival, someone jealous of your success, someone who just didn't like you, and you'd never know who did it. The betrayals must have been constant. The paranoia must have been exhausting. Now here's something that really gets me about these laws. The punishments weren't equally distributed. Shocking, I know. If you were wealthy enough, you could sometimes just buy your way out of the restrictions entirely. Florence had a brilliant little system starting in 1415. The law said women couldn't wear luxury items, silk velvet, elaborate embroidery, all that stuff. But if you were willing to pay the city government 50 florins per year, you got an exemption. You could wear whatever you wanted. 50 florins doesn't sound like much until you realise that was about 6 months' salary for a skilled craftsman. It was the price of a small house. But for wealthy merchants who wanted their wives and daughters to compete with noble families in fashion, they'd pay it gladly. Because that's what this really was, a luxury tax. A way for the government to make money while pretending to enforce morality. The cynicism is breathtaking when you think about it. We're going to tell you it's sinful and wrong to wear these clothes, but if you pay us enough money, suddenly it's fine. Your soul is apparently less endangered if you've got 50 florins to spare, and this created the most absurd situations. You'd have 2 women sitting next to each other in church wearing nearly identical silk gowns. One is breaking the law and could be arrested at any moment. The other paid her annual fee and is completely legal. Same dress, same display of wealth, different permission slip. But let's get back to Salvaggio, because his story represents something important. Remember, he was caught 5 times. 5 times. And yet he kept wearing his forbidden black silk with its illegal silver embroidery. Why would anyone do that? A historian named Beatrice Galastro studied the Genoese Sumptuary law records and found something fascinating. She discovered that the fines, while significant, were actually modest compared to the cost of the clothes themselves. A full outfit in silk velvet with metallic thread embroidery could cost as much as a luxury sports car would cost today. If you could afford to buy the clothes in the first place, you could definitely afford to pay the fine. So for people like Salvaggio, the fines became just another cost of fashion. Like we might budget for designer jeans or expensive sneakers, they budgeted for illegal clothes plus the fine. It was worth it to them. Because when he walked down that street in his black silk doublet, Salvaggio wasn't just wearing an outfit, he was making a statement. He was saying, I matter, I have taste, I have resources, I refuse to be invisible. And maybe, just maybe, he was saying something else too. He was saying, you don't get to tell me who I am. Here's what I find most heartbreaking about all of this. These laws were constantly published and generally ignored. That's a quote from a historical source about Italian sumptuary laws. Constantly published and generally ignored. The governments kept making new rules, stricter rules, more detailed rules, and people kept breaking them, because you can't legislate away human nature. You can't make laws that override people's deep need for self-expression, for beauty, for identity. The Renaissance authorities tried. They really tried. They created entire bureaucracies dedicated to controlling what people wore. They hired officials. They established courts. They wrote thousands of pages of regulations. They imposed fines, confiscations, public humiliations, even imprisonment. And it didn't work. The fashion kept evolving, the people kept pushing boundaries, the merchants kept getting richer, the middle class kept rising, and eventually by the 1600s most of these laws were abandoned. In England, all sumptuary legislation was officially repealed in 1603. Not because people suddenly decided it was a bad idea, but because everyone finally admitted what had been obvious for decades: the laws were unenforceable. You can't arrest everyone, you can't fine everyone, and you definitely can't stop people from wanting to look beautiful. But before we get to that ending, before the laws collapsed under their own absurdity, there were centuries of people living under this system. Real people like Salvaggio, people who had to make daily calculations about what to wear, people who had to weigh their desire for self-expression against the very real possibility of punishment, people who sometimes chose fashion in any way knowing the cost. And that's what I want you to think about as we continue this journey together. When we look at Renaissance paintings, those gorgeous portraits of people in elaborate clothes, we're not just looking at art, we're looking at evidence of courage in a way, evidence of people who insisted on being seen even when being seen could ruin you, because that's what the next 2 hours are really about. Not just the funny, absurd, ridiculous extremes of Renaissance fashion, though trust me, we're going to get into some truly wild stuff, but also the very human story underneath it all. The story of people fighting for the right to express themselves, to be themselves, even when that fight was against the government, against the church, against society itself. Salvaggio d'Este, arrested 5 times for wearing black silk, never stopped. And he wasn't alone. Across Europe, thousands of people made the same choice: to wear what they wanted, to pay the fines, to risk the consequences. Because some things are worth fighting for, even if the thing you're fighting for is just the right to wear nice clothes. And now we're going to meet the specific ways this fight played out. Because if you think Salvaggio's black silk was controversial, wait until you hear about the colour that could literally get you executed. The colour so dangerous, so restricted that wearing it was considered treason against the state. We're going to talk about purple. And trust me, the story is even stranger than you think. Purple, just think about that word for a moment. Purple, today it's just another colour. Maybe you're wearing something purple right now. Maybe your favourite shirt is purple. Maybe you painted your bedroom wall purple. And nobody cares, oh. Nobody even notices. But rewind about 2,000 years and that innocent colour choice could have gotten you executed. Not fined, not arrested, executed, as in killed by the state for the crime of wearing the wrong shade. I want you to imagine something with me. You're living in the late Roman Empire, maybe around the 4th or 5th century. You're walking through the marketplace and you see the most beautiful fabric you've ever laid eyes on. It's a deep, rich purple, the kind of purple that looks almost alive, that seems to glow in the sunlight. It's hanging in a merchant's stall and you have enough money to buy it. You reach out to touch it and the merchant literally slaps your hand away. Because that fabric, that particular shade of purple, that's Tyrian purple. And unless you're the emperor himself, even looking at it too long feels dangerous. This is where our story of fashion control really begins, not in the Renaissance, but centuries before, in a world where colour wasn't just aesthetic, it was law, it was power, it was life and death. Let me tell you about Tyrian purple, because this might be the most expensive substance in human history relative to its time, and I'm not exaggerating. Tyrian purple, also called royal purple or imperial purple, was a dye made from sea snails. Specifically from the mucus glands of a particular type of murex snail found in the Mediterranean. And here's the thing that made it so incredibly valuable: you needed roughly 10,000 snails to produce just 1 gram of dye. 1 gram. That's about the weight of a paperclip. Think about what that means. You've got people diving into the Mediterranean Sea, collecting thousands upon thousands of these snails. Then they've got to extract these tiny glands, then crush them, then process them in a way that takes weeks and produces a smell so absolutely putrid that dye factories had to be located far outside city limits because the stench was unbearable. All of this for enough dye to colour maybe a small strip of fabric. A single pound of Tyrian purple dye cost more than a pound of gold. More than gold. The Greek historian Theopompus wrote that purple-dyed wool was worth its weight in silver, and that was still an understatement for the finest shades. So naturally this became the colour of emperors. In ancient Rome only the emperor himself could wear the toga picta, a pure Tyrian purple toga. Senators could have a thin purple stripe on their togas, high-ranking magistrates got purple stripes on their tunics, but that deep, full royal purple that belonged to one person only, and the Romans didn't mess around about this. During the transition from republic to empire, when the laws really solidified wearing imperial purple, if you weren't the emperor wasn't just illegal, it was treason, high treason, the kind of crime that meant death. Now you might be thinking, okay, but that's ancient Rome. Surely by the Renaissance people were more reasonable about this, right? Oh, you sweet summer child. Number, if anything, it got worse. See, the Byzantine Empire, which was basically the eastern continuation of Rome, took this purple obsession to absolutely insane levels. In Byzantium, purple wasn't just for the emperor's clothes. They had an entire room in the imperial palace called the Porphyra, literally the purple chamber, where empresses gave birth. Children born in this room were called porphyrogenitus, born in the purple, and it gave them special status in the line of succession. They were so obsessive about this that Byzantine emperors would sign official documents in purple ink. Purple ink. If you signed something in purple ink without permission, that was a crime. Can you imagine, sorry, your contract is invalid and also you're under arrest because you used the wrong pen colour? The laws were absolutely rigid. A 10th century Byzantine law code explicitly states that anyone who dares to wear imperial purple, anyone who even tries to manufacture the dye for imperial purple without authorization would be guilty of treason and face execution. And they enforced this. They really enforced this. There are records of people being executed for wearing purple. Actual human beings killed by the state because they wore the wrong colour. But here's where this story gets really interesting and kind of darkly funny, in that absurd way that human behaviour can be. By the time we get to the Renaissance Tyrian purple, the real stuff made from snails had mostly disappeared. The traditional production methods were largely lost. The Byzantine Empire fell in 1453, and with it went a lot of that institutional knowledge. But did that stop people from obsessing over purple? Absolutely not. They just found new purples to ban. Renaissance sumptuary laws across Europe specifically prohibited certain shades of purple and violet. In Venice, deep purple velvets were restricted to the nobility. In Florence, purple silk was on the forbidden list for common citizens. In England, Elizabeth I's proclamation in 1562 explicitly states, "None shall wear in his apparel any silk of the colour purple cloth of gold tissue, but only the king, queen, and their immediate family, except dukes and marquises." Dukes and marquises got a tiny exception. They could wear purple in their doublets and sleeveless coats, but even then the cloth couldn't exceed £5 per yard in cost. £5 in 1562 money was absolutely astronomical. For context, a skilled labourer might make £30 in an entire year. So even the allowances came with price restrictions. You have permission to wear purple, but only if you can prove you paid enough for it. The gatekeeping is mind-blowing. And it wasn't just purple, of course. The colour hierarchy extended to all sorts of shades. Gold cloth fabric woven with actual gold thread that was restricted to royalty almost everywhere. Crimson red, which required expensive imported dye from cochineal insects that was heavily regulated. Certain shades of scarlet. Specific types of deep blue made from indigo or woad. Colours had status built into them. You could literally look at someone from across a church and know their approximate social rank just by the colours they wore. Or at least you were supposed to be able to. That was the whole point. But human nature being what it is, people found ways around these laws. Always. They always do. In Florence, remember that exemption system I mentioned? The one where you could pay 50 florins a year to wear luxury items that applied to colours too. Rich merchants' wives would pay that fee and then walk around in purple silk and crimson velvet, in gold-embroidered gowns, and the nobility would absolutely lose their minds about it. You've got letters from the period aristocrats writing to each other complaining bitterly about how you can't tell who's who anymore. How dare that merchant's daughter wear the same shade of purple as a countess? How dare she? The outrage is palpable on the page 500 years later. And you know what? I get why they were upset. Not because I agree with them this whole system was ridiculous, but because I understand what they were afraid of. They were watching their world change. Old money was losing its monopoly, new money was rising, and they could see it happening every single day in living colour, walking down the street. Let me tell you a story that perfectly captures this tension. In Venice in the early 1500s there was a massive controversy over something called paganazzo. Paganazzo was a particular shade of deep purple, almost burgundy, that became fashionable among wealthy Venetian women. It wasn't quite the imperial purple that was still theoretically off limits, but it was close enough that it made people nervous. The Venetian Senate debated for months about whether to ban it. You've got these grown men senators of one of the most powerful city-states in Europe spending hours arguing about whether this specific shade of purple-ish red crosses the line. They brought in dyers to testify. They examined fabric samples. They consulted old law codes, and in the end they banned it. But here's the kicker: women kept wearing it anyway. They'd wear it to church, they'd wear it to public events. When officials would try to fine them, they'd argue about the exact shade. This isn't paganazzo, this is morello, totally different colour, see how it's more brownish in this light. Became this massive game of colour semantics. The government kept issuing new proclamations trying to be more and more specific about exactly which shades were forbidden. And the women kept finding new shades that were technically legal, but basically the same colour. It's like the Renaissance equivalent of malicious compliance, and I absolutely love it. Now here's something I find really fascinating. Throughout all of this, there's this underlying assumption that we need to talk about. The assumption that colour means something, that it has inherent value, that purple is somehow objectively more special than, say, brown. But is purple really more royal than other colours? Or did we just decide it was because it was expensive and rare? Think about it. The only reason purple became associated with power is because of those 10,000 snails. It was scarce, so it became valuable. So it became exclusive, so it became powerful. It's completely arbitrary. In another world where purple flowers were common and easy to extract dye from, maybe purple would be the colour of peasants and gold would be forbidden. The meanings we assign to these things are made up. But once those meanings are established, once they are written into law and enforced for generations, they start to feel natural. They start to feel inevitable, like purple just naturally belongs to emperors, like it would be weird wrong even for a common person to wear it. That's how power works. It takes arbitrary distinctions and makes them feel permanent. And the Renaissance authorities understood this intuitively. They knew that controlling colour was controlling meaning. It was controlling the visual language that everyone could read. When you saw someone in purple, you were supposed to think authority, power, wealth, nobility. When you saw someone in brown homespun wool, you were supposed to think peasant labourer, unimportant. The colours were doing the work of social hierarchy without anyone having to say a word. So when merchants started wearing forbidden colours, they weren't just breaking a law. They were scrambling the signal. They were saying the old hierarchies don't apply anymore. I can be wealthy without being noble. I can have power without having a title. I can wear purple. And that terrified the establishment. Because if anyone can wear purple, what does purple even mean anymore? If the visual markers of status are up for grabs, how do we know who deserves respect, who deserves power, who deserves to be listened to? The whole system starts to fall apart. There's a part of me that finds this incredibly hopeful, actually. Yes, people were fined and arrested and sometimes even killed over these laws. That's horrific, and we shouldn't minimize that. But also people kept breaking them. People kept saying, no, actually I'm going to wear what I want. They kept dyeing fabric purple, wearing it out in public, but paying the fines and doing it again. And eventually the laws couldn't hold. Reality caught up with them. By the 1600s, purple dyes became more accessible. New trade routes brought new dyeing techniques. Chemical knowledge expanded, and suddenly purple wasn't so rare anymore. When England repealed its sumptuary laws in 1603, one of the things that had become obvious was that you just couldn't control colour anymore. Too many people had access to too many dyes. The technology had democratized something that used to be exclusive, and you know what happened. The world didn't end. Nobles didn't become indistinguishable from commoners just because commoners could wear purple. Society didn't collapse. The thing they were so afraid of, the thing they'd been enforcing with violence for centuries, turned out to be survivable after all. Maybe even good. I think about this sometimes when I'm getting dressed in the morning. I'll put on a purple shirt. I've got this soft lavender one I really like. And I think about all those people throughout history who would have been punished for wearing this. All those people who fought for the right to wear whatever colours they wanted. All those merchants' daughters in Florence paying their annual fees just to wear crimson. All those Venetian women arguing about the exact shade of paganazzo. They were fighting for something that seems so basic now, the right to wear a colour. But it wasn't basic then, it was revolutionary. And they won. It took centuries and a lot of them paid serious prices for it, but they won. Today I can wear purple and you can wear purple and nobody bats an eye. That's because of them. Because of people who said this law is stupid and I'm going to break it. There's something beautiful about that kind of courage. The courage to insist on something small like wearing a colour you're not supposed to, knowing that small thing represents something much larger. Freedom, dignity, the right to express yourself. But as wild as the colour restrictions were, as absurd as grown men debating the exact shade of purple in the Senate chambers was, we're just getting started with the truly bizarre fashion laws of the Renaissance. Because at least with colours there was sort of a logic to it. Expensive dye equals restricted colour. You can follow the reasoning even if you disagree with it. But coming up next, we're going to talk about a fashion trend that had absolutely no practical justification whatsoever. A fashion trend so ridiculous, so excessive, so utterly absurd that Renaissance authors literally wrote satire about it. A fashion trend that involved men walking around with padded, decorated, jewel-encrusted bulges pointing out from between their legs, competing to see whose was biggest. I am talking, of course, about the codpiece. And trust me, this story is even more bizarre than you're imagining right now. So there's this portrait hanging in the Tower of London. It's of King Henry VIII, and if you've ever seen it, you know exactly what I'm about to talk about. Henry is standing there, legs apart, shoulders back, looking every bit the powerful monarch he wanted to be. He's wearing an elaborate doublet, jewels everywhere, rich fabrics. But your eye doesn't go to any of that. Your eye goes straight to the centre of the painting where there's this enormous, gleaming, impossibly large bulge protruding from between his legs. That's a codpiece. And before you ask, no, that's not what Henry actually looked like under his clothes. That's padding, decoration, fashion. And here's the truly wild part, every fashionable man in Europe was wearing one. Welcome to perhaps the strangest fashion trend in human history. A trend so bizarre that when it finally died out, people seemed to collectively agree to just not talk about it. Like, oh, remember that century when we all wore decorative genital pouches as outerwear? Yeah, let's maybe not bring that up at parties, but we're going to talk about it. Because the story of the codpiece is actually a perfect example of how something practical can become absurd, how masculinity gets weaponized through fashion, and how eventually even the most entrenched trend can become too ridiculous for society to sustain. Let's start with the origin story, because the codpiece actually began as a solution to a legitimate problem. And I mean that sincerely. This wasn't always about showing off. Back in the late 1400s, men's fashion was changing. For most of the Middle Ages, guys wore long tunics that went down to their knees, or even their ankles, very modest, very covered. But around the 1480s, 1490s, hemlines started rising. Doublets, that's the jacket part, got shorter, and shorter and shorter. Meanwhile, men were wearing hose, not like modern pantyhose, but these were basically two separate leg coverings, one for each leg tied to a belt at the waist, like really long socks that you tied to your underwear belt. Fashion historians don't come for me, I'm simplifying. So here's the problem. As doublets got shorter, rising up above the waist, there was suddenly this gap. This very revealing gap where the two hose legs met, and underneath just a thin layer of linen underwear. Or sometimes nothing at all if we're being honest about medieval hygiene situations. Men needed something to cover that gap, for modesty, for protection, for basic functionality. So tailors came up with this triangular piece of fabric that would bridge the space between the two legs of the hose. They called it a codpiece, from cod, which was slang for scrotum. Classy name, right? And for a little while that's all it was, a modest triangular flap, practical, unobtrusive, problem solved. But then, and this is so predictably human, it almost hurts someone had an idea. If we're putting a piece of fabric there anyway, why not make it bigger? Why not add some padding? Why not shape it? Why not make it decorative? Why not indeed? By the 1520s, 1530s, codpieces had gone from practical to prominent. They were padded, they were shaped into these upward-pointing projections, they were covered in expensive fabric, silk velvet brocade, they were embroidered with gold thread, they were decorated with ribbons, bows and jewels, and the size kept increasing. It became a competition. Whose codpiece is bigger? Whose is more elaborate? Whose draws the most attention? The peak of codpiece mania hit around the 1540s. This is when we get those portraits of Henry VIII with his absolutely massive codpiece that looks like he's smuggling a small watermelon. This is when armour, actual suits of battle armour, started being made with metal codpieces attached. Not subtle metal codpieces, mind you. Prominent steel bulges crafted with the same care as the breastplate. There's a suit of Henry's armour on display at the Tower of London, and the codpiece on it is so large, so ornate, that for years female visitors to the Tower had a tradition. They would stick pins into the lining of the codpiece, believing it would increase their fertility. I am not making this up. This was a real thing that happened well into the 20th century, because apparently even modern people looked at that thing and thought, that's a lot of masculine energy, maybe some of it will rub off. Now you might be wondering, did anyone think this was ridiculous? Did anyone point out that men were basically walking around with decorative fake erections attached to their pants? Oh, absolutely. Renaissance writers had a field day with this. François Rabelais, the French Renaissance author, wrote a satirical book in 1532 called The Histories of Gargantua and Pantagruel. In the prologue, he refers mockingly to a fictional book called On the Dignity of Codpieces. Just the title is a joke. The Dignity of Codpieces. He's making fun of scholarly treatises by suggesting there could be a serious academic work about the philosophical importance of decorative crotch pouches. But here's what's darkly funny about that satire there. Kind of was a dignity associated with codpieces. At least that's how men treated them. A large, elaborate codpiece was a status symbol. It said, I'm wealthy enough to afford this expensive accessory. I'm fashionable enough to be current. I'm masculine enough to draw attention to this area. It was quite literally a dick measuring contest, except the dicks being measured were fake padded and hanging on the outside of your pants for everyone to see. The absurdity is breathtaking. But wait, there's more. And this is where the story gets even weirder, if you can believe it. So there's this epidemic that swept through Europe starting in 1494. Syphilis. It appeared suddenly, or at least it was suddenly recognised and named, and it spread like wildfire. Especially among soldiers, mercenaries, and yes, fashionable courtiers who were, shall we say, socially active. Syphilis in its active stages caused visible sores, particularly on the genitals. And the only treatment they had was mercury-based ointment. This stuff was nasty. It was corrosive. It stained fabric. It had to be applied directly to the affected areas and left there for hours. So where do you put that mercury ointment while you're wearing your expensive silk hose and fancy doublet? Where do you hide the visible signs that you're being treated for what was considered a shameful disease in your codpiece? Yes, the codpiece, which had started as modesty covering, then became a fashion statement, now had a third function: disease concealment. Men would stuff their codpieces with cloth soaked in mercury ointment, treating their syphilis, while simultaneously projecting an image of exaggerated virility. The codpiece became essentially a portable medicine cabinet for your sexually transmitted infection, while also being a symbol of your sexual prowess. The contradiction is so perfect it feels like satire, but it's just history being history. And this is where I need you to appreciate the full picture of what's happening here. You've got Renaissance men, and I'm talking about nobles, courtiers, knights, wealthy merchants, walking around court, attending banquets, dancing at balls with these enormous decorative bulges strapped to their crotches. Inside those bulges might be coins, because yes, men used codpieces as pockets, or handkerchiefs, or snacks. There are actual records of men storing small items in their codpieces, but also potentially mercury-soaked bandages treating their syphilis sores. So when a lady at court compliments a gentleman on his particularly impressive codpiece, there's a non-zero chance he's hiding a venereal disease in there. And everyone's just pretending this is normal. This is sophisticated. This is the height of fashion. I cannot stress enough how much I wish I could go back in time and see one of these court gatherings, just to watch a room full of grown men in jewelled codpieces trying to out-masculine each other, while also secretly treating their STDs. The psychological energy in that room must have been incredible. But eventually society hit peak codpiece. There's only so far you can take a trend before it collapses under its own ridiculousness. In England, they literally made laws about it. The Sumptuary Act of 1562 specifically calls out the monstrous and outrageous greatness of codpieces. Monstrous and outrageous greatness, that's the actual legal language. Parliament was so bothered by how big men's codpieces had gotten that they wrote it into law. The law tried to restrict elaborate codpieces to courtiers, people who actually attended the royal court. The implication being that if you're going to wear something that ridiculous, at least do it where the king can see it and it serves some kind of display function. But regular guys out on the street. Your codpiece is too big, sir. Please make it smaller. It's offensive. Can you imagine being the enforcement officer responsible for that? Walking around London, measuring men's codpieces. Excuse me, sir. I'm going to need you to come with me. Your decorative genital pouch exceeds the legal limit. I'm afraid we're going to have to confiscate it. The mental image alone is worth the price of admission to this history lesson. What I find really interesting, though, is what the codpiece reveals about masculinity as a construct. Because this wasn't just about fashion, it was about what men thought it meant to be a man. The codpiece emphasized the genitals. It drew every eye directly to that area. It exaggerated size, suggested constant readiness, projected power. It said, This is what makes me a man. This is my source of authority. Look at it, admire it, fear it maybe. But it was fake. It was padding and decoration and illusion. The actual man underneath bore no resemblance to the codpiece presenting him to the world. It was a lie, but a lie everyone agreed to participate in. And when you think about it that way, the codpiece becomes this perfect metaphor for toxic masculinity in general. This desperate need to project strength, virility, dominance. This competition with other men over who can appear most masculine. This reduction of male worth to one specific body part and its presumed function. All of it performed exaggerated, ultimately hollow. The Renaissance codpiece is every modern guy who drives a comically large truck or talks constantly about his sexual conquests or works out obsessively not for health but to intimidate other men. Same energy, same insecurity, same desperate performance of masculinity to cover up the fear that maybe you're not enough. And here's the thing, it didn't work then and it doesn't work now because eventually people see through the performance. Eventually the codpiece becomes ridiculous. Eventually society collectively decides, you know what, this is stupid, and we're done with it. By the 1590s, codpieces were on their way out. Men's fashion shifted. The peace god belly came into style. That's where you pad your stomach instead, creating this weird rounded silhouette. Because apparently men just needed to pad something, but the codpiece itself shrank. It got smaller, more modest, less noticeable, and then it just disappeared. By the early 1600s, codpieces were gone from mainstream fashion. Men went back to just wearing pants like normal people. Imagine that. But here's what gets me. When the codpiece died out, it died completely. There was no nostalgia for it, no revival, no vintage codpiece movement. It just ended, and everyone seemed relieved to move on. Unlike other fashion trends that cycle back platforms, bell-bottoms, whatever the codpiece stayed dead. There have been a couple of attempted revivals. Some rock stars in the 70s and 80s wore decorative codpieces as part of stage costumes. Cameo's lead singer Larry Blackman was famous for his, but even then it was clearly costume, clearly performance, clearly not serious fashion. Because I think on some level we collectively learnt the lesson. We look back at Renaissance portraits of men in enormous codpieces and thought, yeah, that was too much. That was us taking masculinity performance way too far. Let's not do that again. Although if I'm being honest, have we really learned? Have we actually moved past the codpiece, or have we just found new ways to perform the same insecurities men still spend enormous amounts of money on things that signal masculine status? Expensive cars, fancy watches, designer clothes, gym memberships, protein supplements, testosterone boosters. The codpiece has just gotten more subtle, more distributed across different consumer categories. We've replaced the obvious literal codpiece with 1,000 smaller codpieces. Same energy, different merchandise, but maybe, and I'm trying to be optimistic here, maybe the fact that literal codpiece died out means there's hope. Maybe it means that, eventually, even the most entrenched forms of masculine performance can be questioned, can be mocked, can be abandoned. Maybe it means that the work of defining what it means to be a man is ongoing, and we're allowed to decide that some definitions don't serve us, that some performances aren't worth maintaining, that we can let go of the need to prove our worth through decorative external appendages, literal or metaphorical. Or maybe I'm reading too much into Renaissance fashion history. Maybe sometimes a codpiece is just a codpiece, a weird thing humans did for a century before moving on to the next weird thing. But speaking of weird things, humans did if you thought men walking around with decorative bulges was the peak of Renaissance fashion absurdity. Wait until you hear about what women were doing with their shoes. Because while men were competing over whose codpiece was biggest women in Venice, were walking around on platform shoes so tall we're talking 20 inches, sometimes more, that they literally couldn't walk without two servants supporting them on either side. Women were falling. Women were getting injured. Women were having miscarriages from falling off their shoes. And they kept wearing them, even after the government tried to ban them, even after doctors warned them, even after all common sense said maybe shoes that require you to have servants just to walk 3 feet aren't worth it. They kept wearing them, because fashion apparently is worth dying for, or at least worth breaking a few bones for. Let me tell you about the chopines, and trust me, this story is going to make the codpiece look sensible by comparison. Picture Venice in the year 1500. The canals are shimmering in the afternoon sun. Gondolas glide past marble palaces. Street musicians play while merchants hawk their wares, and through this beautiful scene walks a woman who appears to be hovering 6 feet above the ground. She's not hovering, of course. She's wearing chopine, platform shoes so impossibly tall that she needs 2 servants, one on each side, just to stay upright. As she takes each careful step, her entire body sways precariously. The servants grip her arms, steadying her. Passers-by stop and stare, not because this is unusual, but because her chopines are particularly impressive today. Maybe 20 inches tall, maybe more. She's literally walking on stilts disguised as shoes. And if you think that sounds dangerous, you're absolutely right. But we'll get to the injuries and miscarriages in a moment. First, let me tell you how we got here. Because like the codpiece, the chopin started with a practical purpose and somehow ended up as one of the most absurd fashion statements in human history. The chopin, also called a zoccolo in Italian, began as a simple solution to a simple problem. If you've ever been to Venice, you know that this city has a complicated relationship with water. It's built on islands, the streets are narrow, and before modern drainage, those streets could get muddy wet and frankly disgusting. Women's dresses in the Renaissance were long, sweeping to the ground. Beautiful, expensive dresses made from silk and velvet that cost a fortune. You didn't want that fabric dragging through mud and sewage and whatever else was in the streets. So someone had the clever idea of creating a platform shoe, an overshoe really, something you'd slip over your regular shoes that would lift your feet and your dress hem up off the dirty ground. Practical, sensible, problem solved. The early chopines were modest, maybe 2 or 3 inches tall, just enough to keep the expensive fabric out of the muck, made from wood or cork covered in leather, functional. But then, and you can probably see where this is going, someone thought if a little height is good, wouldn't more height be better? Wouldn't taller chopines keep my dress even cleaner? Wouldn't they make me stand out in a crowd? Wouldn't they make me literally taller than everyone else? And once that competitive instinct kicked in, there was no stopping it. By the 1500s, Venetian chopines had become status symbols. The height of your chopines directly corresponded to your social standing. The taller the platform, the wealthier and more important you were presumed to be. And they got tall. Really tall. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York has a pair of chopines in their collection that measure over 11 inches. The Museo Corre in Venice has a pair that's nearly 20 inches tall. That's almost 2 feet. That's the height of a toddler. Imagine strapping your feet to the top of a 2-foot-tall wooden platform and then trying to walk, while wearing a dress so long it reaches the ground. In a crowded city, on cobblestones, the physics alone are terrifying. But Venetian women did this, regularly. Because the chopin had become more than just a shoe, it had become a symbol of everything they wanted to project. Wealth, because chopines were expensive to make. Status, because height implied importance. Refinement, because you needed servants to help you walk, which meant you had servants to spare. It was conspicuous consumption in its most literal form. Look how much money I have. I can afford to make walking nearly impossible for myself. I can afford the servants to help me. I can afford to be impractical. Now here's where the chopine story intersects with something we talked about earlier, Those sumptuary laws. Remember how governments were obsessed with controlling who could wear what? Well, Venice had strict sumptuary laws, really strict. One of the things Venetian law specifically prohibited was long dress trains. You know, when the back of a dress drags on the ground behind you for several feet. That was forbidden for most women because it was seen as excessively luxurious and wasteful of fabric. But here's the loophole that Venetian women discovered. The law said you couldn't have a train. It didn't say anything about how long your dress could be if it didn't drag on the ground. So women started wearing chopines, really tall chopines, and then making their dresses long enough to reach the ground over those tall platforms. The dress wasn't dragging, it was just appropriately long for their new height. Technically legal. But the longer the dress, the more fabric it used, and the more fabric it used, the more expensive it was. And everyone watching could do that math. A woman in 20-inch chopines needed several extra feet of expensive silk or velvet just to make her dress reach the ground. The fabric alone might cost as much as a house, and she's communicating that wealth to everyone who sees her while technically following the letter of the law. The law said no trains. It didn't say you couldn't tower above everyone else in a dress that required enough fabric to clothe 3 normal people. Checkmate sumptuary legislators. But the Venetian government wasn't stupid. They could see what was happening, and in 1430 they tried to do something about it. They passed a law limiting chopines to 3 inches in height. 3 inches. That was the legal maximum. Anything taller than that and you were breaking the law. Want to guess what happened? Go on, take a guess. After everything we've learned so far about how Renaissance people responded to fashion restrictions, what do you think Venetian women did when told their chopines could only be 3 inches tall? They ignored it. Completely. The law was passed and then systematically disregarded by basically everyone. Women kept wearing taller and taller chopines. The government kept issuing warnings and occasionally fining people, and the chopines kept getting taller. By the late 1500s, 20-inch chopines weren't even that unusual. They were aspirational, certainly, but they weren't shockingly rare. The law said 3 inches. Reality said 20 inches, and reality won. I kind of love this. I love that despite all the power structures, all the legal systems, all the official proclamations, people just looked at the 3-inch rule and said, yeah, no, we're not doing that. There's something beautifully rebellious about it. Of course there were consequences to walking around on shoes this tall. Real serious, sometimes tragic consequences. The historical records mention women falling. A lot. Thomas Coryate, an English traveller who visited Venice in the early 1600s, wrote about witnessing Venetian women tumbling out of their chopines, just falling right off them onto the street. And these weren't minor stumbles. These were falls from significant heights. Imagine you're walking along 6 feet tall because of your shoes, and suddenly you lose your balance. You've got layers of heavy fabric, you're top heavy, and you're plummeting toward cobblestones. Women broke bones. Women sustained serious injuries. And some women, and this is the truly heartbreaking part, some women had miscarriages from falling off their chopines. The historical records are pretty clear about this. The Venetian government eventually tried to restrict chopin height, again specifically citing reports of women falling and losing pregnancies. These weren't rumours. This was documented. Women were literally risking their ability to have children for the sake of fashion, and still they kept wearing them. Now we need to talk about what it actually felt like to wear these things, because the physical experience is part of what makes this story so wild. First, you couldn't walk normally. It was impossible. Your feet were strapped to these wooden platforms with leather or silk bands. Your weight was entirely on your toes and the balls of your feet. Every step required careful balance. Contemporary sources describe the way women walked in chopines as comical. One writer said it made women move with an unstable and inelegant gait. Another compared it to how someone walks when drunk. But there's a fascinating counter-narrative too. An Italian dancing master named Fabrizio Carozzo wrote a manual in 1600 called it Nobilità di Dame, Nobility of Ladies, and in it he claims that with practice a skilled woman could walk in chopines with grace, seemliness and beauty. So which was it? Were women wobbling around ridiculously or were they graceful? I think the answer is both. I think there was probably a learning curve. Your first few times in 20-inch platforms, you're probably stumbling all over the place, gripping your servant's arm for dear life, looking absolutely absurd. But with practice, maybe months or years of practice, you could probably develop a technique, a specific way of moving that worked with the platforms instead of against them. There might have been a whole skill set around this, a body knowledge passed down from mothers to daughters, how to shift your weight, how to take small steps, how to use your servant's support efficiently. Maybe there were even social hierarchies around it. Women who could walk gracefully in tall chopines were considered more sophisticated than women who couldn't. It's wild to think about. A whole physical skill that women had to master just to participate in fashion. Like learning to walk in high heels today, but exponentially more difficult and dangerous. Let me share something from Shakespeare because, yes, even Shakespeare couldn't resist commenting on chopines. In Hamlet, there's a scene where Hamlet is talking to a young actor, and he says the actor has grown since Hamlet last saw him. And then Hamlet adds, "You are nearer to heaven than when I saw you last by the altitude of a chopine." Nearer to heaven by the altitude of a chopine. It's a joke about height, obviously. But it's also Shakespeare acknowledging that Chopinists were so well known, so prominent in culture, that he could make a reference to them and expect his English audience to get it. Even though Chopins were primarily a Venetian thing, their fame had spread across Europe. They'd become synonymous with ridiculous fashion excess. And that phrase, nearer to heaven, there's something almost poetic about it, isn't there? These women were literally elevating themselves, trying to rise above the crowd, trying to get closer to something higher, something better, something more important. But at what cost? There's this nun I need to tell you about. Her name was Arcangela Tarabotti, and she lived in Venice in the 1600s. And unlike basically every male writer who was mocking chopines and calling them ridiculous, Tarabotti actually defended them. She wrote that chopines elevated women above the earthly triviality. That's a quote, above the earthly triviality. She saw chopines not as vanity, but as symbolically lifting women out of the mundane, the dirty, the low. She saw them as empowering. Now there's some debate about whether Tarabotti was being sincere or satirical. Some scholars think she might have been trolling the male critics, taking their attacks on chopines and flipping the logic. But I prefer to think she meant it. I prefer to think that for some women, chopines really did feel empowering. Because think about what daily life was like for women in Renaissance Venice. Their choices were limited. Their opportunities were restricted. They couldn't hold most jobs. They couldn't vote. They couldn't own property in many cases. Their marriages were arranged. Their lives were controlled by fathers, then husbands, then sons. But chopines were a choice they could make. An expensive, impractical, possibly dangerous choice, but their choice. And when they wore those chopines, they were taller than everyone else. They could literally look down on people. For a moment they were elevated, above the earthly triviality. Maybe that was worth falling for. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. Plenty of male writers absolutely hated chopines, and their hatred is so over the top that it's kind of funny. One critic wrote that women in chopines looked like monsters with the head and torso of a child perched on the legs of a giant. Another called them ridiculous instruments. Others complained that chopines made women half flesh, half wood. And there's something revealing in that language, isn't there, monsters? ridiculous, half wood. These men were genuinely disturbed by chopines, not just annoyed disturbed, like chopines represented something deeply wrong with the world. I think what bothered them was the same thing that bothered male writers about purple fabric and illegal silk. It was about control, or the loss of control. When women wore chopines, they were changing the visual landscape. They were making themselves impossible to ignore. They were demanding space and attention. They were literally rising above their prescribed station. And for men who believed women should be modest, quiet, unobtrusive, submissive, well, a woman towering over you on 20-inch platforms is none of those things. She's impossible to miss. She's taking up space. She's making a statement. She's refusing to stay in her place. Here's my favourite detail about chopines, though, and this really captures the absurd contradictions of the whole situation. In Venice, both courtesans and patrician women, that's high-class noble women, wore chopines. Both groups, and they wore similar styles, similar heights, similar decorations, which meant that in practice you often couldn't tell a courtesan from a noblewoman just by looking at her shoes. This drove the Venetian authorities absolutely crazy. The whole point of sumptuary laws was to make social distinctions visible, to make sure you could tell who was who at a glance. But chopines were creating confusion. A successful courtesan in expensive chopines and silk dress could look nearly identical to a wealthy merchant's wife. The moral boundaries were getting blurry. The visual markers weren't working anymore, and the government couldn't figure out how to fix it without banning chopines entirely, which they knew wouldn't work because women had already ignored every height restriction they'd ever tried to impose. So you had this situation where respectable women and courtesans were wearing the same fashion, breaking the same laws, projecting the same status signals. The categories were collapsing, and all because of some ridiculously tall shoes. Eventually, like all fashion trends, the shopping craze died out. By the mid-1600s, they were falling out of favour. Women started preferring lower, more manageable heels. The extreme height became associated with an earlier generation. Fashion moved on. The reasons are debated. Some historians think it was the injury rate eventually. Enough women got hurt that the style lost its appeal. Some think it was economic changes that made the extreme fabric consumption less viable. Some think it was just fashion being fashion cycling through trends, and chopines had their moment and then passed. But I think part of it was that chopines had proven the point they needed to prove. Women had demonstrated that they could take a piece of functional footwear, turn it into an extravagant status symbol, ignore every law that tried to restrict it and persist in wearing it despite mockery, danger and government opposition. They'd shown that they had power. Maybe not political power, not legal power, but cultural power. The power to shape fashion, the power to define beauty, the power to decide what was worth doing even if men thought it was ridiculous. And once that point was made, maybe the chopines themselves weren't necessary anymore. Although I have to say chopines never went away entirely. They evolved. The platform shoe concept survived. In the 1800s, you had platform boots. In the 1970s, platform shoes came roaring back. In the 1990s, platforms again. Today you can walk into any shoe store and find platform sneakers, platform sandals, platform everything. We're still doing it. We're still making ourselves taller through footwear. We're still willing to sacrifice comfort for height. We're still using shoes as status symbols and fashion statements. The chopine is dead. Long live the chopine. But here's the thing, modern platforms are maybe 3, 4, 5 inches at most, nothing compared to Renaissance Venice. We've collectively decided that 20 inches is too far, that there's a limit to how much height is worth pursuing. So maybe we did learn something. Maybe the chopine's legacy is teaching us that yes, fashion can be art, can be self-expression, can be rebellion, but also maybe don't risk miscarriage for it. Maybe 2 feet is too tall. maybe some practical limits make sense. And that tension between self-expression and practical limits, between individual choice and social norms, between what we want to wear and what society says we should wear, that's the tension we've been exploring this whole time. From Salvaggio arrested 5 times for his black silk to purple dye worth more than gold to codpieces, stuffed with syphilis ointment to chopines that required servants to walk in. These aren't just funny historical anecdotes. They're stories about people fighting for the right to define themselves. Even when that fight looks absurd in retrospect, even when the thing they're fighting for seems trivial, even when they're literally risking death for the right to wear a colour or a height or a style. But fashion has never been trivial. That's what these stories teach us. Fashion is political. Fashion is personal. Fashion is power. And every time someone tells you what you can't wear, they're telling you something about how they see you, how they want to control you, what box they want to keep you in. And every time you wear it anyway, whether it's Salvaggio in his black silk or a Venetian woman on her 20-inch chopines, you're pushing back against that box. You're insisting that you get to decide who you are. Now, speaking of fashion, as control of laws trying to regulate what bodies can wear, we need to talk about fabric. Because while women were fighting gravity in their chopines and men were competing with their codpieces, there was another battle raging across Renaissance Europe. A battle over silk and velvet and lace. A battle where the crime wasn't just wearing expensive fabric, it was touching it, making it, selling it. Where tailors could face death for sewing the wrong material. There's a tailor's shop in Milan sometime in the 1560s. It's early morning. The shop isn't open yet, but inside a man is working by candlelight. He's sewing a dress. The fabric is beautiful, deep crimson velvet with delicate silver embroidery along the bodice. His hands move quickly, expertly. He's been doing this for 30 years. There's a knock at the door. Sharp. Official. The tailor's hands stop mid-stitch. He knows that knock. He's heard it before. When he opens the door, 2 magistrates are standing there. They push past him into the shop. One of them picks up the dress he was working on, examines the fabric, runs his fingers over the velvet. "Who ordered this?" the magistrate asks. The tailor doesn't answer. He knows it doesn't matter. Because in Milan in 1560-something, making a dress from crimson velvet for anyone below a certain social rank isn't just breaking a rule, it's a crime. And the punishment for this particular crime isn't a fine. It's prison for the tailor, not just for the woman who would wear the dress, for the person who made it. Welcome to the world of fabric crimes, where the material itself could be illegal, where touching the wrong textile could destroy your livelihood, and where entire families could be ruined because someone sewed silk instead of wool. Let's talk about fabric, because up until now we've been talking about colours and styles and specific garments, but the Renaissance obsession with controlling fashion went even deeper than that. It went down to the molecular level, basically, to the threads themselves, to what those threads were made of. In Renaissance Europe, not all fabrics were created equal. And I don't just mean in terms of quality or beauty, I mean legally. Legally, fabrics had hierarchies built into them. Some fabrics were for nobility, some were for wealthy merchants, some were for craftsmen, some were for peasants. And you stayed in your fabric lane, or you faced consequences. At the top of the hierarchy, silk. Beautiful, soft, luxurious silk that came from far away and cost a fortune. In most Renaissance cities, silk was restricted. Only certain classes could wear it. And even within silk, there were sub-hierarchies. Silk velvet was more restricted than silk taffeta. Silk woven with gold thread was the most restricted of all. Then came wool, but not all wool was equal either. Fine wool, carefully combed and tightly woven, that could be regulated too. Coarse wool was fine for everyone, but that smooth, soft, expensive wool from England or Flanders, That might be restricted depending on where you lived and who you were. Linen was generally okay for most people. Cotton was becoming more common but was still somewhat expensive. And at the bottom, hemp. Beaten tree bark in some regions, the cheapest, roughest fabrics that marked you instantly as poor, as low status, as not worth noticing. Your clothing wasn't just your clothing, it was a label, a tag, a walking advertisement of your legal status in society. Now, enforcement of these fabric laws was intense, and I mean really intense. More intense than the colour laws, more intense even than the style laws. Because fabric was easier to identify from a distance, easier to prove in court, and easier to build a whole enforcement infrastructure around. In Italian cities, particularly Florence and Siena, they had a system that's almost dystopian in its thoroughness. When new sumptuary laws were passed that banned certain fabrics, citizens were required by law to bring their existing clothing to a government office for inspection. Imagine that. You hear that the government has banned silk for people of your social class, so you have to gather up all your silk dresses, your silk doublets, everything silk you own, and physically carry them to a government building. Officials examine each piece. They mark it, literally sew an official tag or stamp into the fabric, and then they decide, can you keep wearing this under an exemption, or do you have to surrender it? Some pieces were confiscated on the spot, just taken. Your property that you paid for, that might have cost you months of savings, gone, seized by the state because the fabric was now illegal for you to own. Other pieces might be marked as legal under specific conditions. You could wear this to church, but not to public festivals. You could wear this inside your home, but not on the street. The specificity is mind-boggling. And if you didn't bring your clothes in for marking, if you tried to hide your silk garments and kept wearing them, that was an additional crime, not just wearing illegal fabric, but evading the marking system. Double violation. But wait, it gets worse. Because the laws didn't just punish the people wearing the fabric, they went after the people making and selling it. Tailors and seamstresses who created clothing from forbidden fabrics faced serious penalties. In many cities, they were fined at higher rates than their customers. The logic was that professionals should know the law better than regular citizens. They should refuse to make illegal garments. They should be the gatekeepers. In Florence, records show that tailors who made forbidden garments could be fined amounts that exceeded what they'd charge for making the garment in the first place. So you'd do the work, collect your fee, and then pay more than that in fines. You'd effectively lose money. And that's if you were lucky. In some cities, repeat offences could mean loss of your licence. You'd be forbidden from working as a tailor, your career, your livelihood, your ability to feed your family. Gone, because you sewed velvet for someone who wasn't supposed to wear it. And in extreme cases, in Milan there are records of tailors being imprisoned, actually jailed, for making clothes from forbidden fabric. Think about that. You're a skilled craftsperson. Someone comes to you with money and asks you to make them a beautiful dress. You make the dress, you do good work, and for that you go to prison. The crime isn't fraud, it's not theft, it's not violence, it's sewing. You're imprisoned for sewing. Now, I need to tell you about a specific case that really drives home how cruel this system could be, because it wasn't just Italian tailors who faced these laws. They existed across Europe with varying levels of intensity. In Scotland, and we haven't talked much about Scotland yet, they had sumptuary laws that were particularly harsh about metalworking clothing. There was a law that said only knights and higher ranks could have silver decorations on their clothing. Only certain nobles could have gold. And the people who made these decorations, the metalsmiths, the craftsmen who worked with precious metals, they faced the death penalty for violations. Not fines, not prison. Death. And not just death. The law specified that all their lands and goods would be forfeited to the crown. So if a metalsmith made a silver button for someone who wasn't legally entitled to wear silver, and he was caught, he could be executed and his entire family left with nothing, his wife, his children destitute, because he made a button. The law is preserved in Old Scots text, and historians who study it note that while we don't have extensive records of these death sentences being carried out frequently, the law existed. It was on the books. It was a real threat that hung over craftspeople every day. Can you imagine working under that pressure? Every order you take and every piece you make, you're calculating, is this customer who they say they are? Are they legally entitled to this? If they're lying to me, will I be the one who pays the price? With my life? The fabric hierarchy wasn't just about luxury, though. It was also about economics. This is important to understand. A lot of sumptuary laws were officially justified as protecting domestic industry. Here's how the argument went. Expensive fabrics like silk were imported, mostly from Italy or the East. When people bought silk, money left the country. This was seen as bad for the national economy. So by restricting who could wear silk, you were supposedly encouraging people to buy local wool instead, supporting domestic weavers and keeping wealth inside the country. England was particularly obsessed with this. They had a huge wool industry. Wool was England's main export. So English sumptuary laws strongly encouraged wearing English wool and heavily restricted imported silk and velvet. There was even a law, this is real, the Caps Act of 1571. It required all men over the age of 6 years, except for nobility and persons of degree, to wear woolen caps on Sundays and holidays. Woolen caps, required by law. If you didn't wear your government-mandated wool cap to church on Sunday, you could be fined 3 farthings per day. 3 farthings doesn't sound like much, but it adds up. And the point wasn't really the fine. The point was forcing consumption of domestic wool. The government was literally legislating what you had to buy and wear to support the national economy. The law was enforced for about 25 years before it was repealed in 1597, presumably because everyone finally admitted it was ridiculous and unenforceable. But the impulse behind it, using fashion law to control economics, that persisted much longer. So you had this situation where fabric choice was simultaneously about social hierarchy, moral virtue, and economic policy, all wrapped up together, and enforcing it required a massive bureaucratic system. Cities employed special prosecutors whose job was investigating fabric violations. They had informants, they had inspectors, they had courts specifically set up to handle sumptuary cases. In Siena, they had an office called the Quattro Censori, the 4 censors. In 1548, these censors tried to control what citizens wore by encouraging people to report violations. Remember that anonymous denunciation box we talked about earlier? That was part of this system. You could write down your neighbour's name, describe what illegal fabric they were wearing, note when and where you saw them, and drop it in the box. And if the case led to a conviction, the informant often received a portion of the fine as a reward. So now you've got a financial incentive to spy on your neighbours, to study what they're wearing, to know the sumptuary laws well enough to recognise violations, to report them. The social fabric, no pun intended, must have been so tense. Can you trust your neighbours, your friends? If someone compliments your dress, are they genuinely admiring it, or are they memorising details to report you later? The paranoia alone must have been exhausting. And here's something that makes this even more complicated. The laws were incredibly specific. I'm talking pages and pages of detailed regulations about exactly which fabrics could be worn by which ranks of people in which contexts. An Elizabethan proclamation from 1562 lists, and I am not exaggerating, dozens of specific fabric types with specific restrictions. Let me give you just a small taste of the language. None shall wear in his apparel any silk of the colour purple, cloth of gold tissue, but only the king, queen, and their immediate family, except dukes and marquises who may wear in doublets and sleeveless coats cloth of gold of tissue not exceeding £5 the yard. That's one sentence, one restriction. The full proclamation goes on like this for pages. Different fabrics, different garments, different ranks, different contexts. It's a legal document that reads like an extremely boring and oppressive encyclopedia of textile regulation. And here's the thing, people were expected to know all this. You were expected to understand which fabrics you were allowed to wear, in which garments, in which settings. Ignorance wasn't an excuse. If you wore the wrong fabric, even if you genuinely didn't know it was forbidden, you could still be punished. How were normal people supposed to keep track of all this? How were tailors supposed to memorize every restriction? How was this system even remotely workable? The answer is, it wasn't. Not really. The laws were so complex that full compliance was nearly impossible, which meant that technically, almost everyone was probably breaking some law, which meant enforcement was selective, which meant the system was ripe for corruption, favoritism, and abuse. Let me tell you about one of the ways people try to game this system. Because humans being humans, whenever you create complex regulations, people will find loopholes. Remember how I mentioned that vertical stripes made from pieced cloth were banned in some cities because they wasted fabric? Well, tailors got creative. If vertical stripes were forbidden, they'd create horizontal stripes, or diagonal stripes. Or they'd commission weavers to produce fabric that had the striped effect built into the weaving itself, rather than piecing it together. The regulations would say you can't have silk above the waist. So tailors would make dresses with wool bodices and silk skirts. Legal. The regulations would say no gold embroidery on sleeves, so they'd put gold embroidery everywhere except the sleeves. Legal. It became this elaborate game of letter of the law versus spirit of the law. And tailors who were good at this, who could create fashionable, expensive-looking garments while technically staying within the regulations, they became sought after. They became valuable, because they could give you the status you wanted without the legal risk. Or at least less legal risk. There was always risk. But here's what really strikes me about all of this. The fabric laws reveal something about how Renaissance society thought about material objects and their meanings. They genuinely believed, that certain materials had inherent value that went beyond their cost. That silk wasn't just expensive, it was fundamentally superior. That wearing silk when you weren't supposed to wasn't just breaking a rule, it was violating a natural order. There's almost a magical thinking quality to it. Like the fabric itself carried some essence that would contaminate or elevate whoever wore it. Like a peasant putting on silk would somehow be stealing something that didn't belong to them, not just in a legal sense, but in an almost spiritual sense. And this gets back to what we've been circling around this whole time, the deep, bone-deep conviction that some people are simply worth more than others. That hierarchy isn't just a social convenience, it's natural, it's right, it's ordained. And that hierarchy must be visible. It must be legible. You must be able to look at someone and know where they stand. Fabric was part of that language. Silk said nobility, wool said common, hemp said poverty, and letting people wear the wrong fabric would be like letting them speak the wrong language. It would create confusion, disorder, chaos. At least that's what they told themselves. That's the story they needed to believe to justify imprisoning tailors and confiscating people's clothes and creating elaborate bureaucracies of fashion control. Of course, like all these systems, it eventually fell apart. By the 1600s, the fabric laws were increasingly ignored. Trade was expanding, new fabrics were being introduced, the middle class was growing wealthier and more powerful, and trying to control what fabric people wore became obviously futile. When England repealed its Sumptuary legislation in 1603, fabric restrictions were part of what went away. The government basically admitted, we can't control this anymore. The market has won. People will wear what they can afford to buy and we can't stop them. And you know what happened? Society didn't collapse. The nobility didn't become indistinguishable from commoners. The world adapted. Yes, it became harder to tell someone's exact social rank just by looking at their clothes. But maybe that was okay. Maybe that was even good. Maybe a society where you can't immediately judge someone's worth by their fabric is actually a more just society. I know that's a modern perspective. I'm not claiming Renaissance people thought this way. But I do think the failure of fabric laws revealed something important. You can't legislate respect. You can't force people to value what you think they should value. And you can't keep people in their place forever, no matter how many laws you write or how many tailors you imprison. The fabric will be worn, the silk will be sold, the hierarchy will crumble, it's just a matter of time. But fabric wasn't the only thing being policed with this level of intensity. Because while tailors were being imprisoned for sewing velvet, there was another moral panic brewing. Another aspect of fashion that drove Renaissance authorities absolutely crazy. Talking about necklines, specifically women's necklines. The amount of skin showing at the neck and chest, the décolletage. Because Renaissance society had very strong opinions about women's bodies and how much of them should be visible, and they were willing to write laws about it, laws that reveal so much about the intersection of fashion, gender, morality, and control that we need to spend some time there. So let's talk about the neckline wars. Let's talk about what happened when religious leaders, government officials, and regular people got into massive debates about whether showing your collarbones was a sin. And trust me, the debates got heated. A woman walks into a church in Genoa. The year is 1520. It's Sunday morning and the cathedral is filling up with worshippers. She's wearing a beautiful dress, deep blue velvet, carefully fitted, modest by most measures. But her neckline sits just low enough to show her collarbones, maybe an inch or two of her upper chest. Nothing scandalous, nothing you'd even notice today. But the priest notices. He stops mid-sermon, points at her, denounces her from the pulpit, says her dress is an affront to God, a temptation to sin, a sign of moral decay. Other congregants turn to stare. Some nod in agreement with the priest. Others look uncomfortable. The woman's face burns with shame. After the service, she's approached by officials. Her name is recorded. She's told she'll be fined unless she modifies the dress. The neckline must be raised, immediately, or she'll face legal consequences. All of this because you could see her collarbones. This happened, not once but repeatedly, across Renaissance Europe. The neckline became a battleground, and like every battleground we've discussed, it reveals so much about power, control, gender, and the way society tries to regulate bodies, especially women's bodies, through the policing of clothing. Let's start with the actual laws, because yes, there were laws about necklines. Specific detailed laws. In the early 1500s, several Italian cities passed regulations explicitly prohibiting low necklines. Genoa banned them. Milan banned them. Rome banned them. The laws typically specified that necklines couldn't be cut below a certain measurement, sometimes measured in inches from the hollow of the throat, sometimes described as no lower than modesty requires, which is delightfully vague and therefore impossible to comply with definitively. Venice, interestingly, was somewhat more permissive about necklines than other cities, but even there, debates raged about how much skin was appropriate. The Venetian government went back and forth on this for decades. The justification for these laws was always framed in moral terms. Low necklines were immodest. They invited lust. They distracted men from godly thoughts. They represented vanity, pride, and moral corruption. A woman showing too much of her chest wasn't just making a fashion choice, she was committing a sin that endangered her soul and the souls of men who looked at her. But here's the thing that's so frustrating about this logic. Who decided how much skin was too much? Who decided that collarbones were dangerous but forearms were fine? Who decided that the shape of a neckline could determine a woman's virtue? Men did. Exclusively men. The legislators, the priests, the magistrates, the officials, all men, writing laws about women's bodies, deciding what women could and couldn't show, claiming it was for women's own good, for moral protection, for the sake of society. And women had no say in it. There's this fascinating historical figure I need to tell you about. John Knox. He was a Scottish Protestant reformer, very influential in the 1500s, and he had opinions, strong opinions, about everything, but especially about women. In 1563, he attended a session of Parliament in Scotland, where Mary, Queen of Scots, was present along with her ladies-in-waiting, and Knox was appalled, absolutely scandalised. He wrote about it later, describing what he saw as stinking pride of women. Stinking pride of women. That's the phrase he used. He was particularly bothered by what he called the terror-getting of their tailies, which historians believe refers to the elaborate embellishment and decoration of women's clothing, possibly including how the bodices were constructed and decorated. The exact meaning is debated, but the emotion is clear. Knox was furious that women were wearing decorative, fashionable clothing. He and other preachers called for sumptuary reform. They wanted laws for order to be taken for apparel. They wanted to control what women wore, how they decorated themselves, how much of their bodies was visible. And here's what's so telling about Knox's language. Stinking pride. Not just pride, but stinking pride. The disgust is palpable. He's not just disagreed with these fashion choices, he's repulsed by them. He's morally outraged that women dare to adorn themselves, dare to draw attention, dare to take pride in their appearance. This is about control. This is about keeping women in their place. This is about making sure women remain modest, quiet, unobtrusive, and under male authority. The neckline debates weren't just religious, though. They were also tied up in complicated ideas about class and morality. See, there was this pervasive logic in Renaissance thinking that connected women's clothing to their sexual morality. A woman who dressed modestly was assumed to be virtuous. A woman who dressed provocatively, and provocative could mean something as simple as a slightly lower neckline, was assumed to be sexually loose. And this created real consequences for women. If you dressed the wrong way, you could be accused of being a prostitute. Not metaphorically, literally. There are records of women being questioned, harassed, or even arrested because their clothing was deemed too immodest. But here's where it gets really twisted. Sumptuary laws regarding prostitutes were a complete contradiction. Different cities had different approaches, and sometimes cities had contradictory approaches at the same time. Strategy 1. Make prostitutes dress differently from respectable women. Some cities required prostitutes to wear specific colours, yellow was common, or specific markers that identified their profession. The idea was that if prostitutes looked different, respectable women wouldn't be confused with them, and prostitution would be less attractive as a profession because of the social stigma of the required clothing. Strategy 2. Forbid prostitutes from wearing fashionable clothing. Don't let them wear silk, don't let them wear jewellery, don't let them wear low necklines. Make them dress plainly so they are clearly differentiated from respectable women. But then there was strategy 3, which contradicted both of the others. Allow prostitutes to wear luxurious, fashionable clothing, including low necklines, so that respectable women would be discouraged from emulating those styles. Make fashionable dress associated with prostitution, so virtuous women would avoid it. Can you see the problem here? If prostitutes are required to wear yellow and a respectable woman wears yellow, she could be mistaken for a prostitute. If prostitutes are allowed to wear silk and low necklines, and respectable women wear silk and low necklines, they could be mistaken for prostitutes. If prostitutes are forbidden from wearing fashionable clothes, but respectable women want to wear fashionable clothes, then the fashion markers don't work anymore. The system was designed to fail, because it was based on the impossible premise that you could determine a woman's sexual morality by her clothing. That virtue was visible, that you could legislate morality through necklines. And this obsession with controlling women's bodies through clothing went beyond just necklines. It extended to how much of the body was visible in general. There's this woman I need to tell you about, Laura Carita. She was an Italian humanist, a scholar, a writer. In 1487 she wrote a letter that's been preserved, and in it she rails against women who strive by means of exquisite artistry to seem more beautiful than the author of their beauty decreed. The author of their beauty, meaning God. She's saying that women who use makeup, elaborate hairstyles, fashionable clothing, anything to enhance their appearance, are essentially arguing with God. They're saying God didn't make them beautiful enough, so they're taking matters into their own hands. And Sarita is furious about this. She represents an interesting voice, a woman who's internalized these patriarchal ideas and is now policing other women, which happened a lot actually. When you live in a system long enough, sometimes you start enforcing it yourself, even when it oppresses you. But what's fascinating about Sarita's letter is what it reveals about the pressure women were under. On one hand, they were told to be beautiful. Beauty was considered a virtue. Renaissance portraits celebrate female beauty. The Petrarchan ideal of blonde hair and pale skin was held up as the standard all women should aspire to. But on the other hand, trying too hard to be beautiful was vain. Using artifice, makeup, hair dye, fashionable clothing was prideful, sinful, arguing with God. So women were supposed to be naturally beautiful without any effort. And if you weren't naturally beautiful enough, well, that was a moral failing too. Double bind is exhausting just to think about. Let's talk about what actually happened when women pushed back against these neckline restrictions. Because they did push back, constantly. In Italy, particularly in wealthier cities where women had access to money and fashionable dressmakers, low necklines remained popular despite the laws. Women would wear them to private parties, to family gatherings, sometimes even to church if they thought they could get away with it. And this created this weird cat and mouse game. Officials would crack down, fine a bunch of women, make examples of them. Women would comply for a little while, raising their necklines, adding fabric. Then gradually the necklines would start dropping again, slowly, incrementally, testing how far they could go before officials noticed, and the cycle would repeat. Fashion historians who study Renaissance clothing note that even in cities with strict neckline laws, the actual clothing that survives, the dresses preserved in museums, often shows lower necklines than the laws would have permitted, which suggests that either the laws weren't enforced consistently, or women were wearing these dresses in private spaces where officials couldn't see them. There's something beautifully subversive about that. Women creating these gorgeous dresses with low necklines, wearing them in their homes, at private gatherings, in spaces where male authorities couldn't police them, taking back their bodies and their choices in whatever small ways they could. But I want to talk about the male gaze here, because that's really what this is about, isn't it? The entire moral panic over necklines is based on the assumption that women's bodies exist primarily to be looked at by men, and that men's reactions to women's bodies are women's responsibility. A woman wears a low neckline, a man looks at her and has lustful thoughts. According to Renaissance logic, whose fault is that? The woman's. She caused him to sin by wearing that neckline. She's responsible for his thoughts, his reactions, his self-control, or lack thereof. This logic is so deeply embedded in the culture that it seems natural. Of course women should dress modestly. Of course low necklines are tempting. Of course men can't be expected to control themselves when faced with visible collarbones. But flip it around for a second. Imagine if the logic went the other way. Imagine if the laws said, men must learn to control their own thoughts and responses to women's clothing. Men who harass women based on their necklines will be fined. Men who blame their lustful thoughts on women's appearance will face legal consequences. That never happened. It never even occurred to lawmakers as an option. Because the fundamental assumption was that men's desires were natural and uncontrollable, and women's bodies needed to be controlled to prevent triggering those desires. This is rape culture before we had a name for it. This is she was asking for it logic embedded in legal codes. This is the idea that women are responsible for men's behavior, that women's bodies are dangerous, that women need to be controlled for everyone's safety, especially their own. And here's something that really gets me. The Renaissance produced some of the most beautiful art of the human form ever created. Paintings and sculptures celebrating the body, including female bodies. Botticelli's Birth of Venus shows a completely naked woman. Titian painted reclining nudes. Michelangelo sculpted nude figures. These artworks were celebrated, commissioned by churches, by nobles, by the wealthiest patrons. They were considered high art, moral improvement, evidence of God's glory in creating the human form. But a real woman showing her collarbones? That was sin. That was dangerous. That needed to be legislated against. The hypocrisy is staggering. Men could paint naked women and be celebrated as artists. Men could sculpt naked women and be paid by the Pope. But actual women with actual bodies needed to cover up almost entirely or face fines and public shaming. It's almost like the ideal woman, according to Renaissance logic, was one who existed only as an artistic representation, not a real person with agency and choices, just an image, frozen, perfect, silent, unable to move or speak or dress herself. This double standard extended to men's clothing too, by the way, but in the opposite direction. Men's fashion in the Renaissance included codpieces, we talked about those earlier, which were literally drawing attention to male genitals. Men wore tight hose that showed the shape of their legs. Men wore short doublets that exposed their hips and buttocks. By modern standards, a lot of Renaissance men's fashion was pretty revealing. But nobody was writing sermons about men causing women to sin through their clothing. Nobody was legislating how high men's necklines could be. Nobody was fining men for wearing clothes that showed their bodies. Why? Because men's bodies weren't seen as inherently dangerous or sinful. Men's bodies were default, neutral, not a source of temptation. Women were the ones whose bodies needed to be controlled. The message was clear. Men are people, women are bodies, men have agency, women are temptation, men make choices, women cause men to make choices. And all of this was enforced through something as simple as how low your neckline could sit. Eventually, like most of these fashion regulations, the neckline laws relaxed. By the 17th century, fashion had moved on. Necklines rose and fell according to trends, not legislation. The moral panic subsided, or at least shifted to panicking about something else. But the underlying logic never fully went away. The idea that women's bodies need to be controlled, the idea that women are responsible for men's reactions to them, the idea that modesty is about covering up, not about respect and dignity. We still see this today, dress codes that target girls for showing shoulders or wearing leggings, modesty culture in religious communities that puts the burden of sexual purity on women, victim blaming in sexual assault cases that asks what the woman was wearing. The neckline laws of the Renaissance might be gone, but the thinking behind them persists. The belief that women's bodies are inherently problematic, that they need to be controlled, that women are responsible for men's behaviour. And every time we see that logic, we should recognise it for what it is. Not protection, not morality, not concern for women's well-being. It's control. It's always been about control. You know what I find hopeful, though? Women kept wearing the necklines they wanted. They found ways around the laws. They wore controversial styles in private. They pushed boundaries little by little. They passed down dresses to their daughters, preserving the fashions they loved even when those fashions were illegal. They didn't let the laws define them. They didn't let male authorities control their bodies entirely. They found spaces, small spaces, private spaces, where they could dress how they wanted. That resistance matters. Those small acts of defiance matter, because they add up over time into bigger changes. Eventually the laws couldn't hold. Eventually, society had to admit that women were going to dress how they wanted, and the world didn't end. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Every person, every woman especially in this case, who insisted on wearing what she wanted, who risked fines or shame or public condemnation, who said, "No, actually, my body is mine and I'll dress it how I choose." Every one of those women was pushing the world toward being a little bit freer. And we're still doing that work. We're still fighting these battles. They just look different now. But necklines weren't the only accessories being policed with religious fervour, because while women's chests were being measured and legislated, there was an entire universe of smaller items, furs, feathers, gloves, jewellery, buttons, yes, buttons, that were also subject to intense legal scrutiny. We've talked about big things, codpieces, chopines, fabric, necklines, but Renaissance authorities were also obsessed with the tiny details, the accessories, the finishing touches, because in a system where every visible element of your appearance was supposed to communicate your exact social rank, nothing was too small to regulate. And some of these accessory laws, they are so specific, so detailed, so absurdly particular that they make everything else we've talked about look reasonable by comparison. We're about to enter a world where the number of buttons on your jacket could get you arrested. Imagine you're getting dressed for a wedding in Bologna, Italy. The year is 1545. You've got your dress ready. It's beautiful, it's legal, you've checked all the sumptuary regulations, but you want to add something special, something to make the outfit complete. So you reach for your favourite accessory, a zibellino. For those of you wondering what in the world a zibellino is, picture this. It's a whole sable fur, like an entire preserved sable, a small weasel-like animal, worn as a fashion accessory. Sometimes the head and paws were removed and replaced with decorative pieces made of gold or silver, encrusted with jewels, with glass eyes that glinted in the light. Wealthy women would drape these over their shoulders or hang them from their belts. They'd carry them around like extremely expensive, extremely dead, extremely bejeweled pets. And in Bologna in 1545, the city government looked at these zibellini and said, "You know what? These have gotten out of hand. If your zibellino has a head or feet made of precious metals and jewels, that's illegal now. You can have the fur. But if you've decorated it with gold and diamonds, we're going to have a problem. A problem over a decorative dead animal." This is where we are. This is the level of specificity we've reached in Renaissance fashion regulation. And trust me, it only gets more absurd from here. Let's talk about accessories, because this is where sumptuary laws reached their peak ridiculousness. We've covered the big stuff, the codpieces, the chopines, the fabrics, the necklines. But Renaissance authorities didn't stop there. They couldn't stop there. Because if you're going to create a visual hierarchy of society, you need to control every detail, every button, every feather, every scented glove, Yes, scented gloves were regulated. Let me explain. Gloves in the Renaissance weren't just for keeping your hands warm, they were status symbols. Luxury gloves were made from the finest leather, kidskin usually, and they were often perfumed. You'd soak them in expensive scents imported from far away. Rosewater, ambergris, musk. These weren't cheap perfumes. We're talking about fragrances that cost as much as a month's rent. And in some Italian cities, scented gloves were on the restricted list. Only certain social ranks could wear them. If you were caught wearing perfumed gloves and you weren't entitled to them by your social class, you could be fined. Think about that. An official sniffing your gloves to determine if you're breaking the law. Excuse me, madame, are those gloves scented? I'm going to need to smell those. Yes, that's definitely rosewater. That's a violation. You're coming with me. The image alone is worth it, but gloves were just the beginning. Let's talk about feathers, because Renaissance people loved feathers in their hats, absolutely loved them. And naturally not all feathers were created equal. Ostrich feathers were the most prestigious. They were expensive because ostriches didn't live in Europe. You had to import these feathers from Africa, which meant they'd travel thousands of miles before landing in your hat. That made them rare, expensive, and therefore restricted to the upper classes. In many cities, only nobility could wear ostrich feathers. If you were a merchant, no matter how wealthy, you couldn't walk around with ostrich plumes bobbing from your hat. You could wear other feathers, maybe pheasant, maybe peacock if you were really well off. But ostrich, that was crossing a line, and enforcement of this was serious. There are records of officials confiscating feathers from people's hats right there on the street. Imagine you're walking to church feeling good about yourself and suddenly an official reaches up and yanks the feather out of your hat. Just plucks it right out and walks away with it. Your hat is ruined. Your day is ruined. All because of bird plumage. The pettiness is extraordinary. Now, we need to talk about pearls because the pearl regulations are so detailed, so specific, so absurdly micromanaged that they deserve their own discussion. Pearls were highly valued in the Renaissance. They were seen as symbols of purity, of wealth, of refinement. Everyone wanted them, but not everyone could have them because the sumptuary laws said so. The regulations didn't just say nobles can wear pearls and commoners can't. That would be too simple. Instead, they specified how many strands of pearls you could wear, how many individual pearls could be on each strand, what size the pearls could be, where on your body you could wear them, whether they could be sewn onto clothing or had to be worn as jewellery, whether they could be combined with other gems or had to be worn alone. In Florence, there's a sumptuary law from the 1500s that specifies that women below a certain rank can wear no more than one strand of pearls, and that strand can contain no more than a specific number of pearls, and those pearls cannot exceed a certain size. Officials were literally counting pearls and walking up to women and counting the beads on their necklaces to make sure they weren't wearing too many. Can you imagine having that job? Good morning, madam. Yes, you look lovely. I'm just going to need to count your pearls real quick. 1, 2, 3, I'm getting 15 here. The legal limit is 12. I'm afraid I'm going to have to issue a citation. The bureaucracy of it all is staggering. And then there are slippers. Yes, slippers. Even footwear that you wore inside your house was subject to regulation. In some cities, certain types of slippers, particularly those made from expensive materials like silk or decorated with embroidery, were restricted to specific social classes. The logic was that slippers were visible when you received guests in your home, and therefore they were part of your public presentation, and therefore they needed to be controlled. So you could have a situation where your outdoor shoes were legal, your dress was legal, your gloves were legal, but your slippers were a violation. You'd be sitting in your own home, hosting a perfectly respectable gathering, and someone could report you for illegal footwear that never even touched the street. The invasion of privacy is remarkable. Even what you wore in your own home in private spaces was subject to legal scrutiny if anyone saw it. But perhaps my favourite example of accessory madness is the regulation of buttons. Buttons, yes, the things that hold your clothes closed. In various European cities, there were laws about how many buttons you could have on a garment. Some laws specified that you couldn't have more than a certain number of buttons on your doublet or jacket. Other laws said you couldn't have decorative buttons that didn't actually function but were just sewn on for ornamental purposes. And in some cases, the material of the buttons was regulated. Silver buttons might be okay. Gold buttons might be restricted. Buttons covered in fabric were usually fine. But jeweled buttons, those could be illegal depending on your social rank. So tailors had to count buttons. They had to think about button placement. They had to consider button materials, all while making a jacket, a simple jacket. Because too many buttons, or the wrong kind of buttons, could mean legal trouble for both the tailor and the customer. There's something almost comical about the image of Renaissance officials examining jackets and counting buttons. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Wait, 8 buttons. The legal limit is 7. Sir, you're under arrest for button excess. I'm being slightly facetious, but only slightly. These laws existed, they were enforced. People were fined for button violations. Let me tell you about one specific case that really captures how absurd the accessory regulations became. In Bologna, we started with Bologna, let's go back there, in addition to the Zibolino regulations. They had rules about belt decorations. Belts in the Renaissance were practical, they held up your clothing, they provided a place to hang purses or tools, but they were also decorative. Wealthy people had ornate belts made from expensive materials, decorated with metalwork, jewels, intricate clasps. And Bologna's government decided this needed regulation. So they specified that belts could only have certain types of decorations, and those decorations could only be of certain sizes, and they could only be placed in certain positions on the belt. The level of detail is mind-numbing. They were regulating the placement of decorative elements on belts. Not whether you could wear a belt, not even whether the belt could be decorated, but where on the belt the decorations could go. At some point you have to wonder, who was writing these laws? Who was sitting in a government office thinking, you know what's really important for social stability? Making sure decorative belt elements are positioned correctly. That's what's going to hold society together. The answer, of course, is that it wasn't about social stability. It was about control, about power, about keeping people in their designated places by controlling every tiny visible detail of their appearance. Here's what really gets me about the accessory regulations, though. They reveal just how much the upper classes were panicking about social mobility, because accessories are, by definition, optional. You don't need perfumed gloves, you don't need ostrich feathers, you don't need pearl necklaces or jeweled buttons or decorative belt buckles. These are all extras, luxuries. The fact that laws had to be written about them means that people who shouldn't have been able to afford them were buying them. Merchants were getting rich enough to buy ostrich feathers. Craftsmen's wives were saving up for pearl necklaces. The middle class was encroaching on luxury accessories that used to be exclusively for nobility. And the nobility was terrified, because if anyone can buy ostrich feathers, what makes a nobleman special? If a banker's daughter can wear the same pearl necklace as a countess, how do you tell them apart? The visual markers of status were breaking down, so they passed more laws. More specific laws, more detailed laws, trying to draw distinctions that would hold, trying to create categories that were enforceable, trying to keep the rising middle class in their place through feather type and button counts and the scent of their gloves. But it didn't work. It couldn't work. Because once money enters the equation, once people can buy their way into status symbols, the old hierarchies start to crumble. You can pass all the laws you want, but if people have money and desire and access to goods, they're going to buy those goods. And enforcement was impossible. How do you monitor every pearl necklace in a city? How do you count every button on every jacket? How do you smell every pair of gloves? You can't. You just can't. So what happened was selective enforcement, which is maybe worse than no enforcement at all, because it meant the laws became tools of harassment and discrimination. If an official didn't like you, or your family, or your religion, or your politics, they could find something in your accessories to cite you for. Maybe your buttons are technically legal but positioned wrong. Maybe your pearls are the right number but slightly too large. Maybe your gloves smell vaguely of perfume, which could be natural or could be a violation. The vagueness of some of these laws, no more decoration than modesty requires, appropriate to one's station, meant that enforcement was subjective. It was up to the official's judgment, which meant it was up to the official's prejudices, preferences, and personal feelings. This is how you weaponize dress codes. You make them so specific and so vague at the same time that everyone is probably in violation of something, and then you enforce them selectively against people you don't like. It's not about fashion, it's about power. But people resisted. Of course they did. In ways small and large, people pushed back against accessory regulations. Some resistance was subtle. You'd wear your illegal pearl necklace under your collar, hidden, but knowing it was there. You'd save your ostrich feather hat for private parties where officials wouldn't see. You'd have jeweled buttons on the inside of your jacket where they weren't visible, but you knew they existed. Other resistance was blatant. Rich merchants would wear their illegal accessories openly, pay the fines, and keep wearing them. The fines were annoying but manageable if you had money. And wearing the accessories despite the fines became its own status symbol. Look at me, I can afford to break the law. And some resistance was creative. Artisans and craftspeople would find loopholes. If ostrich feathers were illegal, they'd dye chicken feathers to look like ostrich feathers. If pearls of a certain size were forbidden, they'd wear slightly smaller pearls in greater numbers to achieve the same effect. If gold buttons were restricted, they'd use brass buttons that looked like gold. The ingenuity is admirable. When you tell people they can't have something, they'll figure out how to get as close to it as possible while technically staying legal. There's something deeply human about this whole accessory situation, because fundamentally people want to adorn themselves. We want to be beautiful. We want to express ourselves. We want to show who we are, who we aspire to be, what we value, and accessories are how we do that. There were the finishing touches, the personal choices, the elements that make an outfit uniquely yours. So when laws tried to control accessories, they were trying to control something very intimate. They were saying, you don't get to express yourself the way you want. You don't get to be beautiful in the way you choose. You don't get to show the world who you are. You have to stay in your box. You have to accept the identity we've assigned to you. And people said no. They said, actually, I'm going to wear this feather. I'm going to perfume these gloves. I'm going to sew on an extra button. Because this is my body, my life, my self-expression, and you don't get to control it completely. Those small acts of defiance, wearing one too many pearls, carrying a slightly too fancy zibolino, adding a decorative button where there shouldn't be one, those were acts of freedom. Tiny freedoms, maybe, but freedom nonetheless. Eventually, like all these systems, the accessory regulations faded away. By the 1600s, most of them were ignored or repealed. Enforcement became impossible. The middle class won. Money won. The market won. Today you can wear as many buttons as you want. You can perfume your gloves if that's your thing. You can wear ostrich feathers, peacock feathers, or a whole bird on your head if you're feeling adventurous. And nobody will arrest you. The laws are gone. but the impulse behind them isn't. We still judge people by their accessories. We still make assumptions about wealth and status based on whether someone's carrying a designer bag or wearing a cheap watch. We still use small details to categorize people, to determine their worth, to decide how we'll treat them. The difference is, now it's social pressure instead of legal pressure. It's judgment instead of fines. But the underlying dynamic is the same. Accessories matter. Details matter. And people will always use those details to assess each other. Maybe that's not entirely bad. Maybe there's something okay about caring about beauty, about craft, about the small touches that make something special. Maybe accessories are art in miniature. But maybe we should also remember what Renaissance people learned the hard way. You can't legislate taste. You can't enforce style. And you definitely can't stop people from expressing themselves through the small, beautiful, deeply personal choices of adornment. So we've covered a lot of ground here. Colours that could kill you, codpieces that could store your syphilis medicine, platform shoes that caused miscarriages, fabrics that could send tailors to prison, necklines that sparked moral panics, and now accessories regulated down to the button count. But there's one aspect of Renaissance fashion control we haven't fully explored yet. Something that connects all of these regulations together, something that made all of this even more dangerous, more insidious, more likely to destroy lives. I'm talking about beauty itself, the pursuit of beauty. Because Renaissance people didn't just regulate what you wore, they had strong opinions about what you looked like underneath those clothes, about your skin, your hair, your face, and the things they did to achieve beauty standards, the substances they put on their bodies, the processes they went through, the risks they took. Some of it was literally poisonous. Some of it was killing them slowly while they pursued the perfect pale skin, the perfect blonde hair, the perfect appearance. Let's talk about the toxic side of Renaissance beauty. And I mean toxic literally. A noble woman sits at her dressing table in Venice. It's morning, sometime in the 1580s. Sunlight streams through the window, catching the bottles and jars arranged before her. She picks up a small container. Inside is a white paste, thick and chalky. She dips her fingers in and begins spreading it across her face, her neck, her chest, layer after layer, until her skin is ghostly pale, flawless, porcelain smooth. The paste is called Venetian ceruse, and it's killing her. The lead in that white makeup, because yes, it's lead-based, is slowly poisoning her body. It's causing headaches, muscle weakness, digestive problems. Over time, it'll corrode her skin, creating pits and scars that she'll cover with more makeup, which will cause more damage, which will require more makeup. It's a death spiral disguised as beauty. But she doesn't know this. Or maybe she does know, on some level, but beauty is worth the risk. Because in Renaissance Europe, pale skin isn't just attractive, it's required, it's moral, it's a sign of virtue, of nobility, of worth. And so she keeps applying the poison, every morning, until her face becomes a mask, until she can't recognize herself anymore, until eventually the lead does what lead does. Welcome to the dark side of Renaissance beauty, where looking perfect could literally kill you. Let's start with that white makeup, because it's everywhere in Renaissance Europe. Everyone who's anyone is wearing it. And by everyone, I mean primarily women, though some men wore it too. The makeup was called different things in different places. In Venice, ceruse. In England, it was often called spirits of Saturn, Saturn being the alchemical name for lead. Sometimes it was just called white lead. Whatever you called it, the base ingredient was the same, lead carbonate. To make it, you'd take strips of lead metal and expose them to vinegar fumes in a sealed container. The chemical reaction would create white lead carbonate powder. Then you'd mix that powder with vinegar, or sometimes with aiguille, whites to create a paste that could be applied to the skin. The result? A perfectly smooth, perfectly pale complexion that made you look like a marble statue. Which was exactly the point. Renaissance beauty ideals glorified pale skin. The paler, the better. Because pale skin meant you didn't work outside, you didn't labour in the sun, you were wealthy enough to stay indoors. You were refined, delicate, aristocratic. Tan skin was for peasants, for labourers, for people of low status. Pale skin was for ladies and gentlemen. So people painted their faces with lead, and their necks and their chests anywhere that might be visible. They'd apply it so thickly that when it dried, their faces would crack if they smiled too much. Some women would barely move their facial muscles to preserve the makeup's smooth appearance. Imagine living like that. Your face is a mask. You can't fully express emotion because your makeup might crack. You're slowly being poisoned. But you look perfect, you look wealthy, you look virtuous. Is it worth it? The effects of lead poisoning are horrific. And they were well documented even in the Renaissance, though people didn't always make the connection between the makeup and the symptoms. Lead poisoning causes headaches, nausea, digestive issues, muscle weakness, tremors, in severe cases, paralysis, brain damage, death. But perhaps the most cruel effect is what it does to the skin itself. Lead corrodes skin tissue. It creates sores, scars, premature aging. The very thing you're using to look beautiful is making you uglier. So you use more makeup to cover the damage, which causes more damage, which requires more makeup. It's a vicious cycle that many Renaissance women were trapped in. Queen Elizabeth I of England was famous for her white makeup. She wore it constantly in her later years. There are accounts describing how thickly she applied it, layers and layers of white lead paste, creating a mask-like appearance. And historians who've studied her health records believe the lead makeup contributed significantly to her declining health in old age. Her skin was reportedly severely damaged, scarred, pitted. So she wore more makeup, heavier makeup, until her face was barely recognizable as a face. It was a white surface, barely human, onto which she'd paint red lips and darkened eyebrows. She became an icon, a symbol, an image, but at what cost to the actual human woman underneath? And it wasn't just the face, let's talk about hair. Because Renaissance beauty standards had very specific ideas about hair colour, and achieving that standard was almost as dangerous as the white makeup. The ideal hair colour, particularly in Italy, was blonde. Specifically a golden blonde that we now call Titian blonde after the painter Titian, who often depicted women with this colour hair. This ideal came from Petrarch, the 14th century poet who wrote endlessly about his beloved Laura and her beautiful golden hair. His poetry was so influential that it created a beauty standard that lasted for centuries. There was just one problem. Most Italian women didn't naturally have golden blonde hair. They had brown hair, black hair, chestnut hair. So if you wanted to meet the beauty standard, you had to change your hair colour. Hair dye recipes from the Renaissance survive in various texts, including medical manuscripts like the Trotula, a collection of medieval and Renaissance medical writings about women's health. Let me read you one of the recipes, because it's wild. For colouring the hair so that it is golden, take the exterior shell of a walnut and the bark of the tree itself and cook them in water, and with this water mix alum and oak apples, and with these mixed things you will smear the head, having first washed it, placing upon the hair leaves and tying them with strings for 2 days. You will be able to colour the hair. 2 days. You'd apply this mixture, wrap your head in leaves, tie it all up and leave it for 2 days. And this is one of the milder recipes. Some recipes involved lye, an extremely caustic alkaline substance that could burn your scalp. Others involved sulfur compounds. Others involved arsenic. arsenic on your head for beauty. But here's what really gets me. Even though these substances were dangerous, even though people knew they caused burns, rashes, hair loss, poisoning, they kept using them, because the social pressure to meet beauty standards was more powerful than the fear of physical harm. A woman with brown hair in Renaissance Italy was fighting an uphill battle. She wasn't meeting the ideal. Poetry and art celebrated golden hair, portraits showed blonde women. Even religious paintings often depicted the Virgin Mary with blonde hair, as if godliness itself was blonde. So women dyed their hair. They sat in the sun for hours, because that was part of many dyeing processes, wearing special hats with the crown cut out so their hair could bleach in the sunlight while their faces stayed pale. They'd sit on their rooftops, exposed to the elements, hour after hour, damaging their hair, burning their scalps, all to achieve that perfect golden shade. The dedication is remarkable, the suffering is heartbreaking. Now, let's circle back to something we touched on earlier in a different context. Remember when I mentioned that codpieces sometimes contained mercury ointment for treating syphilis? Well, mercury shows up in beauty treatments too, because of course it does. Mercury was used in various cosmetic preparations. Mercury-based creams were supposed to remove freckles, age spots, blemishes. They were supposed to create that perfect, flawless complexion. And they did work in a sense. Mercury does bleach and alter skin pigmentation. It also causes mercury poisoning, which includes symptoms like tremors, insomnia, memory loss, neuromuscular effects, headaches, and cognitive impairment. Severe mercury poisoning can cause kidney damage, respiratory failure, and death. But hey, at least your freckles are gone. The thing about mercury, though, is that its effects are cumulative. You don't notice them right away. You might use a mercury cream for months before symptoms appear, and by then, you've already damaged your body in ways that can't be reversed. So you've got Renaissance women using lead on their faces and mercury on their skin and caustic chemicals on their hair. They're literally poisoning themselves from multiple directions. And for what? To meet a beauty standard, to be considered attractive, to be deemed worthy of love, marriage, social acceptance. The beauty standards weren't just oppressive in an abstract way, they were concretely physically harmful. They were killing people. There's this concept we need to talk about that was central to Renaissance thinking about beauty. It's captured in a Latin phrase that appears on the back of Leonardo da Vinci's portrait of Ginevra de' Benci. The phrase is, Virtue tem forma decorat. Beauty adorns virtue. Or to put it another way, your physical beauty is a reflection of your inner virtue. Beautiful people are good people. Ugly people are morally suspect. Your appearance reveals your soul. This idea was everywhere in Renaissance culture. It justified the obsession with beauty. It made beauty not just desirable, but morally necessary. If you weren't beautiful, it suggested something wrong with your character. So you had to be beautiful. You had to meet the standards, no matter the cost. And the standards were narrow. Pale skin, golden hair, smooth, flawless complexion, small waist, specific proportions. The ideal was very particular. Most people couldn't naturally meet it, so they tried to force their bodies to comply. Lead makeup, mercury creams, caustic hair dyes, tight corsets that restricted breathing, bloodletting to maintain a pale complexion, arsenic ingestion. Yes, some people actually ate small amounts of arsenic, as it was supposed to improve complexion. The lengths people went to are staggering. And underneath all of it is this idea. Your worth as a person is visible on your body. Beauty equals goodness. Ugliness equals vice. Therefore, you must be beautiful at any cost. But here's the profound irony. The very pursuit of beauty was destroying beauty. The lead makeup corroded skin. The mercury creams caused lasting damage. The hair dyes made hair brittle and prone to falling out. The arsenic caused premature aging. Women would start using these products young, trying to enhance their natural beauty. By their 30s or 40s, their skin would be damaged, scarred, discolored, so they'd use more products, heavier makeup, stronger chemicals, making everything worse. There are accounts of women whose faces were so damaged that they couldn't be seen without makeup. The makeup had become a necessity, not a choice. They were trapped. Their true faces were gone, replaced by a chemical mask that was slowly killing them. And society looked at these women and praised their dedication to beauty, their commitment to appearance, their willingness to suffer for virtue. The cruelty of it is overwhelming when you really think about it. Men weren't entirely exempt from this, by the way, though the beauty standards for men were different and generally less physically damaging. Men were supposed to be fair-skinned too, though not as pale as women. They were encouraged to have clear complexions, strong features, healthy-looking skin. Some men used cosmetics, powders to mattify shiny skin, rouges to add colour to cheeks, perfumes to smell pleasant. But the expectation wasn't the same. A man with tan skin from riding or hunting might be seen as rugged, masculine, appealing. A woman with tan skin was low class, unattractive, suspect. A man with some facial scarring from smallpox or accidents might be seen as having character. A woman with similar scarring was disfigured, unmarriageable, pitied. The double standard was profound. Men were allowed to be human, to have bodies that showed signs of life, activity, experience. Women were supposed to be perfect, porcelain, untouched, ideal. And if achieving that ideal required poison, well, that was the price of femininity. Eventually people started to wise up. Slowly, very slowly. By the 17th century, there was growing awareness that lead and mercury cosmetics were harmful. Medical texts began explicitly warning against them. Some women began seeking safer alternatives. But change was gradual. Beauty standards don't shift quickly, and the alternatives weren't always much better. Women might switch from lead-based makeup to bismuth-based makeup, which was still toxic, just slightly less so. The real shift came with changing beauty ideals. As fashion moved away from the ultra-pale Renaissance aesthetic towards slightly more natural looks, the need for heavy white makeup decreased. As women's roles in society began to very slowly expand, the equation of beauty with virtue began to weaken. As scientific understanding improved, the dangers of these substances became undeniable. But it took centuries. Centuries of women being poisoned, centuries of suffering for beauty, centuries of bodies damaged, lives shortened, health destroyed, all in pursuit of an ideal that was itself created by society that valued women primarily for their appearance. And here's what haunts me about this story. We'd like to think we've learned. We'd like to believe that modern beauty standards are different or more enlightened. But are they? We're not using lead makeup anymore, thankfully, but we're still using products that aren't entirely safe. We're still pursuing beauty standards that require intervention, products, procedures. We're still judging people, especially women, primarily on their appearance. We're still equating beauty with worth. The specific toxins have changed. The underlying logic hasn't. Today it's chemical peels instead of mercury creams, Botox instead of arsenic, extreme diets instead of corsets and bloodletting. We've swapped lead for filler injections, mercury for laser treatments, arsenic for appetite suppressants. We've made it safer, yes. We've made it more regulated, more medicalized, more controlled. But we're still pursuing perfection. We're still altering our bodies to meet externally imposed standards. We're still teaching people that their natural appearance isn't good enough. And while we're not dying from our beauty routines as dramatically as Renaissance women did, We're still suffering. Eating disorders, body dysmorphia, depression, anxiety, financial strain from expensive treatments, physical pain from procedures, psychological damage from never measuring up. The lead has been removed, the poison is still there. I think about those Renaissance women sometimes. The ones who sat at their dressing tables each morning applying their toxic makeup, dyeing their hair with caustic chemicals, looking in their mirrors and seeing someone who needed to be fixed, someone who wasn't beautiful enough naturally, someone who had to work, suffer, poison themselves to be acceptable. I think about how they probably didn't enjoy this process, how it probably hurt, how they probably wished they could just be naturally beautiful, naturally acceptable, naturally enough, but they couldn't, because society had decided what beauty was and their natural selves didn't fit, so they changed, they suffered, they complied. And I wonder how different we really are, how much we've really changed, how much freedom we've really gained. Because yes, we've eliminated the lead and mercury, but we haven't eliminated the pressure, we haven't eliminated the judgment, we haven't eliminated the message that who you naturally are isn't good enough. Maybe that's the real poison, not the lead, not the mercury, but the idea that you need to be fixed, that your worth is in your appearance, that beauty is a moral requirement. That poison is still very much with us. Now we've spent a lot of time exploring all the different ways Renaissance fashion laws controlled people. The colours, the fabrics, the styles, the accessories, the beauty standards. We've seen how these laws functioned, how they were enforced, how they harmed people, how people resisted. But we haven't fully explored the why behind all of this. Yes, we've touched on social hierarchy and power, but there's another dimension we need to examine. The economic dimension. Because fashion laws weren't just about keeping people in their place socially, they were about money, about wealth, about who got to have it and who didn't. We need to talk about the economics of looking rich while going broke, about how the fashion arms race bankrupted families, about how sumptuary laws were actually about controlling wealth as much as controlling appearance, about how some people paid for their clothes in ways that destroyed their children's futures. Let me show you just how expensive this obsession with fashion really was. There's a merchant's ledger from Florence dated 1538. The handwriting is cramped, careful, recording every florin spent and earned. And on one particular page there's an entry that stops you cold. One dress for my wife, silk velvet with gold embroidery, 280 florins. 280 florins. For context, a skilled craftsman in Florence at this time earned about 30 florins per year. This single dress cost nearly 10 years of a craftsman's salary, and this wasn't even the most expensive item in the ledger. A few pages later, outfit for my daughter's wedding, complete with accessories, 420 florins. This merchant is spending fortunes on clothing, actual fortunes, the kind of money that could buy houses, establish businesses, secure futures, and he's putting it on his family's backs. Why? Because in Renaissance Florence, how you dressed wasn't just personal expression, it was economic warfare. It was a declaration of your wealth, your status, your right to be taken seriously. And if you couldn't afford to dress the part, you couldn't play the game. So people borrowed, they mortgaged, they went into debt, they bankrupted themselves, their families, sometimes their entire extended networks, all to buy clothes they'd wear a handful of times before fashion moved on and they needed new ones. This is the economics of Renaissance fashion, and it's brutal. Let's start by establishing just how expensive clothing really was, because I don't think modern people fully grasp the scale of investment we're talking about. In the Renaissance, creating fabric was incredibly labor-intensive. You had to shear sheep or harvest flax or cultivate silkworms. You had to clean and process the raw material. You had to spin it into thread, hours and hours of spinning by hand. Then you had to weave it into fabric on a loom, which took more hours. Then, if you wanted colour, you had to dye it using expensive dyes that often came from far away. A single bolt of quality fabric could take weeks or months to produce, and that's before you even get to making the actual garment. Then you needed a tailor or dressmaker, skilled labour, someone who could cut the fabric precisely, sew it together, add embellishments. For a complex garment, fancy dress with embroidery, a decorated doublet, you might need multiple craftspeople, tailor for the main construction, an embroiderer for the decorative work, a jeweller if you wanted metallic elements, each person charging for their specialised skills. The result? A single high-quality outfit could easily cost as much as several months' wages for an average person. An elaborate outfit could cost a year's wages, or more. And remember that we talked about earlier, that outfit made of silk velvet with precious metal embroidery. Historians who've calculated the costs estimate that a full outfit like that, the kind wealthy merchants wore to show off, could cost the equivalent of a modern luxury sports car. We're talking $60,000, $80,000, $100,000 in today's money for one outfit that you'd wear a few times before it went out of fashion. Now you might think, okay, but that's just the super wealthy. Regular people weren't spending that kind of money, and you'd be partially right. Regular people weren't buying silk velvet suits, but they were still investing significant portions of their income in clothing. More than we do today, proportionally, because clothing in the Renaissance wasn't disposable. You didn't have closets full of cheap options. You had a few garments that you wore repeatedly, mended carefully, maintained obsessively. For most people, their clothing represented one of their largest financial assets. A peasant family might own 2 or 3 outfits total. Work clothes and slightly nicer clothes for church or special occasions. Those clothes would be carefully maintained, repaired when they wore out, passed down to children. When someone died, their clothing was specifically itemized in wills because it had real value. For middle-class families, clothing was a major investment. You might save for years to buy a nice dress for your daughter's wedding. That dress would then be worn on special occasions for the rest of her life. Carefully preserved, maybe altered as fashions changed, eventually passed down to her daughter. Everything about clothing said, this is valuable, this matters, this is worth investing in. Which makes sense when you think about how visible clothing was. You couldn't hide your economic status. It was on your body. Everyone could see it. Your clothing announced who you were to everyone you encountered. But here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting, I mean economically devastating. The rising merchant class in Renaissance Italy had money. Real money. Often more money than the old nobility. But they didn't have noble titles. They didn't have the social status that came with generations of aristocratic lineage. So how do you announce that you've arrived? That you're wealthy, important, worthy of respect? You buy the most expensive clothes you can afford. You dress like nobility, even if you're not noble. You outdress the nobles if possible, showing that your new money is just as good as their old money. This created an arms race, an economic competition fought with fabric and embroidery. The merchants would buy increasingly expensive clothes. The nobles, offended and threatened, would buy even more expensive clothes to differentiate themselves. The merchants would escalate further, and so on. And this is where those sumptuary laws we've been discussing all night actually tie into economics. The laws weren't just about maintaining social hierarchy for its own sake. They were about economic control, about preventing this arms race, about keeping new money in its place. Because if a wealthy merchant could dress like a duke, what made the duke special? What justified the duke's power and privileges? The visible markers of status were breaking down, and that threatened the entire social order. Let me tell you about the exemption system in Florence again, because we touched on it earlier, but I want you to understand the full economic implications. Remember, starting in 1415, Florence had a law saying women couldn't wear luxury items, silk, elaborate jewellery, certain colours. But if you paid the government 50 florins per year, you got an exemption. You could wear whatever you wanted. 50 florins was a huge amount of money. But for wealthy merchants who wanted their wives and daughters to compete with nobility in fashion, it was worth it. So they paid, every year, 50 florins just for the privilege of wearing nice clothes. Think about what this means. The government was literally selling fashion rights. They were monetizing status, and in doing so they were creating a situation where wealth could, officially and legally, buy you out of sumptuary restrictions. This completely undermined the supposed purpose of the laws. If the laws were about maintaining moral standards and preventing excess, how does it make sense to say excessive luxury is sinful? Unless you pay us, then it's fine. Your soul is apparently less endangered if you've got 50 florins to spare. The hypocrisy is stunning, but the economic logic is clear. The government saw an opportunity to raise revenue. Wealthy people saw an opportunity to buy status, and the old nobility watched in horror as money became more important than bloodline. Now let's talk about credit and debt, because very few people could actually afford to pay cash for high-end Renaissance fashion. So credit systems developed, and they were predatory in ways that feel disturbingly modern. Tailors and fabric merchants would extend credit to customers. You could order a dress, have it made, receive it, and then pay it off over time. With interest, of course. Sometimes substantial interest. There are records of people owing money to tailors for years. Debt that kept accumulating because they couldn't pay it off before ordering something new. Because fashion kept changing. Because you needed new clothes for the next season, the next wedding, the next important event. And here's the really cruel part. If you couldn't pay, the tailor could take you to court. There are actual court records of tailors suing customers for unpaid clothing debts. And when someone lost these cases, which happened frequently, they might have their wages garnished. They might have property seized. They might lose their reputations, which could destroy business prospects. People were being financially ruined over clothes, over the pressure to maintain appearances, over the desperate need to look wealthy, even if it meant going broke. The tragic irony is palpable. You're buying expensive clothes to signal that you're financially successful. But buying those clothes is making you financially unsuccessful. The signifier destroys the thing it's supposed to signal. And then there were the dowries. Oh, the dowries. This is where the economics of fashion gets truly heartbreaking. In Renaissance Italy, when a woman married, her family provided a dowry, essentially a payment to the groom's family. The size of the dowry determined in many ways what kind of match the family could arrange. Larger dowries meant access to wealthier, higher status husbands. But here's the thing. Part of the dowry, often a significant part, was the bride's trousseau. Her clothing, her jewellery, her accessories, all the things she'd bring into the marriage. These items were itemized, valued, and counted as part of the financial transaction. So families would invest heavily in their daughter's clothing. Not just one wedding dress, but multiple outfits, nice fabrics, good jewellery, everything needed to make their daughter an attractive marriage prospect. This could cost hundreds of florins, sometimes thousands for wealthy families trying to marry into nobility. And remember those sumptuary law fines we talked about? In Florence, if a woman was fined for wearing illegal clothing, the fine could be deducted from her dowry, directly, immediately reducing her marriage value, potentially ruining her prospects. Can you imagine? Your mother saves for years to build your dowry, buying you nice clothes so you can marry well. You wear one of those dresses to church. An official decides the neckline is too low or the fabric is too fancy or some detail violates some law. You're fined, and that fine is taken directly from your dowry. Your future is now less secure. Your marriage prospects are diminished. Because of a neckline, the system was designed to punish women economically for fashion choices, to make their financial futures contingent on compliance with arbitrary clothing rules. But it wasn't just dowries at risk. Entire families could be impacted by fashion debt. Let me tell you about credit networks. In Renaissance Italy, families didn't operate as isolated economic units. They were part of extended networks. If your brother-in-law needed to borrow money, you might lend it to him. If your cousin was short on cash, the family might pool resources. Economic obligations were social obligations. So when someone in the family went into significant debt, say, to pay for fancy clothes, it affected everyone. The family might need to contribute to paying off that debt, or the person in debt might be unable to help other family members when they needed it. Economic pressure radiated outward, and if someone defaulted on fashion debt, if they simply couldn't pay what they owed to tailors or fabric merchants, the shame affected the whole family. The family's reputation would suffer. Their creditworthiness would be damaged. Other merchants might refuse to do business with them. One person's fashion choices could have multi-generational economic consequences. A father who overspent on his wife's wardrobe might leave his sons unable to borrow money to start businesses. A mother who went into debt for her daughter's trousseau might damage her family's standing in ways that affected her other children's marriage prospects. The ripple effects were enormous. Fashion wasn't just personal, it was familial, communal, economic infrastructure. And here's something that really highlights the absurdity of all this. Clothing recycling and resale, because yes, there was a robust second-hand clothing market in Renaissance Europe. Precisely because clothing was so valuable. When someone died, their clothing was inherited. But not everyone could wear the deceased's clothes. They might not fit, or they might be too fancy for the heir's social station, or they might be out of fashion, so they'd be sold. There were merchants who specialized in used clothing, markets where you could buy second-hand garments. And here's the thing that makes this both practical and heartbreaking. Clothing was often taken apart and remade. If a dress was too old-fashioned to wear, you'd unstitch it, save the fabric, and have it remade into something current. Or you'd use the expensive fabric for something else. Cushion covers, children's clothes, household linens, nothing was wasted, because the fabric itself was too valuable to discard. Even if the garment was worn out, the material had worth. But this also means that very few complete garments survive from the Renaissance. Most of them were worn until they couldn't be worn anymore, then taken apart and repurposed. The historical record is sparse because people couldn't afford to preserve clothing. They needed to extract every bit of value from it. So when historians try to study Renaissance fashion, they're often working from paintings and written descriptions because the actual objects are mostly gone, used up, recycled, worn to threads in pursuit of getting maximum value from an expensive investment. Now the economic motivations behind sumptuary laws become clearer when you understand all this. Governments claimed the laws were about morality, about preventing excess, about maintaining social order, but the economic justifications were always there too, especially the claims about protecting domestic industry. The argument went like this. Expensive fabrics like silk and velvet were mostly imported. When people bought these luxury fabrics, money flowed out of the country. This was bad for the national economy. So by restricting who could wear silk and velvet, you were encouraging people to buy local wool instead. This kept money inside the country, supported local weavers and textile workers, and strengthened the domestic economy. England was particularly obsessed with this. They had a massive wool industry. Wool was England's main export and a crucial part of the economy. So English sumptuary laws were heavily focused on promoting English wool and restricting imported silk. Remember that Caps Act we mentioned earlier? The one that required men to wear woolen caps on Sundays? That was explicitly about supporting the domestic cap-making industry. The government was forcing consumption of local products through legal mandate. It didn't work very well. People resented being told what to buy. They found ways around it. They wore the minimum required and then switched to what they actually wanted. But the impulse reveals something important about how authorities thought about fashion. It wasn't just social, it was economic. It was about controlling markets and money flows. And there's one more economic dimension we need to discuss, the inflation of status goods. Because as more people gained access to expensive clothing, the clothing had to become even more expensive to maintain its exclusivity. This is basic economics. If everyone has silk, silk isn't special anymore. So the truly wealthy need to find something even more expensive. Silk woven with real gold thread. Silk with elaborate embroidery that took months to complete. Silk in colours that required rare, expensive dyes. The bar kept rising, the costs kept escalating. Because the whole point was differentiation. The whole point was being able to look at someone and immediately know they were wealthier than other people. And as the middle class got wealthier, the upper class had to spend more to stay visibly ahead. This created immense pressure at every level. The upper middle class trying to look like lower nobility, the lower nobility trying to distinguish themselves from wealthy merchants, the upper nobility trying to outshine everyone, each group stretching their budgets, going into debt, competing in a fashion arms race that no one could really win. And at the bottom, regular people who couldn't possibly compete but were still judged by their appearance, still evaluated by their clothing, still found wanting because they couldn't afford to participate in the game. The system was designed to be impossible. That was the point. The point was to keep people striving, spending, never quite achieving, always reaching for the next level of expense and display. Eventually, as we've seen with every aspect of these fashion systems, it became unsustainable. By the early 1600s, the economic strain was too much. People were too far in debt. The credit systems were collapsing. The arms race couldn't continue. And maybe more importantly, attitudes were starting to shift. The Protestant Reformation brought with it an emphasis on modesty and restraint. Conspicuous consumption started to be seen as vulgar rather than admirable. Different values emerged, not everywhere and not all at once, but gradually the economic model of fashion as warfare started to break down. People started questioning whether bankrupting yourself for clothes made sense, whether the appearance of wealth was worth the reality of debt. It's tempting to see this as progress, as people becoming more sensible, more rational about fashion spending, and maybe it was, partially, but I also think people just got tired of the pressure, tired of the competition, tired of never having enough, never looking quite right, never achieving the impossible standard. Sometimes systems don't collapse because of moral enlightenment. They collapse because people are exhausted, and that exhaustion, that weariness with the whole system of fashion competition and economic pressure, that's going to become important. Because as we move forward, we're going to meet the people who said enough, who refused to play the game, who broke the rules not out of ambition or desire for status, but out of rebellion against the entire structure. We're going to talk about the fashion criminals, the repeat offenders, the people like our friend Salvaggio from the very beginning, caught 5 times and still wearing his illegal silk. The people who looked at all these laws, all this pressure, all this expense and said, no, I'm going to wear what I want, fine me, arrest me, I don't care. Because that's the thing about oppressive systems. Eventually, they create their own resistance. Eventually, people fight back. And the story of how Renaissance people fought back against fashion laws, the tactics they used, the risks they took, the changes they created, that's where our story gets really interesting. September 15th, 1595, Genoa, Italy. We've met this moment before. Salvaggio d'Asti walking down the street in his illegal black silk doublet with silver embroidery. Officials spot him. They record his violation. They fine him. But here's what I didn't tell you before. This isn't just Salvaggio's second offence, or even his third. This is his fifth time being caught. His fifth time being officially documented, fined and publicly reprimanded for wearing forbidden clothing. And you know what he does after this fifth arrest? He keeps wearing the silk. He just keeps wearing it. There's no sixth arrest on record, but historians who've studied the case believe that's probably because officials gave up. Not because Salvaggio stopped, but because at some point even law enforcement gets tired of chasing the same person for the same victimless crime. Salvaggio wasn't just a fashion enthusiast, he was a fashion criminal, a repeat offender. A man who looked at the sumptuary laws, understood them perfectly, and decided they didn't apply to him. Not because he thought he was above the law, but because he believed the law was wrong. And he wasn't alone. Across Renaissance Europe there were thousands of people like Salvaggio. People who became rebels through their wardrobes, who fought the system one illegal garment at a time, and eventually, collectively, they won. Let me introduce you to some of these fashion criminals, because they're fascinating. Each one represents a different type of resistance, a different relationship to the laws they were breaking. First, there are the persistent offenders like Salvaggio, people who got caught repeatedly and just kept going. The historical records from Genoa are particularly rich in these cases because Genoese officials were meticulous record keepers. We have names, dates, descriptions of what they were wearing, and when you read through these records, patterns emerge, the same names appearing multiple times, sometimes the same exact outfit being cited in multiple violations, which suggests the person was deliberately wearing the forbidden garment repeatedly, almost defiantly. One historian who studied these records, Beatrice Galastro, found something remarkable. Out of all the sumptuary violations recorded in Genoa during the period she studied, there were 289 men and 242 women cited. 289 men. That's more than the women. This shatters the assumption that fashion laws primarily targeted women. Men were actually violating sumptuary laws more frequently than women, at least in terms of getting caught and recorded. And what were these men wearing? Mostly black silk, black taffeta, black satin, black velvet, all with metallic embroidery or lace trim. Which might sound plain to us today. Black clothing seems conservative, right? But in Renaissance Genoa, black dye was one of the most expensive and difficult to produce. Getting a true deep lasting black required multiple rounds of dyeing with costly materials. A black silk outfit was actually more expensive and prestigious than many colourful ones. It was a status symbol masquerading as modesty. And when you see portraits from this era, like the ones painted by Anthony van Dyck in Genoa, you see these men in their supposedly plain black silk. They look sober, dignified, almost austere, but they were criminals, every one of them wearing outfits that violated the law. Then there are the wealthy women of Venice. And oh, these women were something else. Let me tell you about the chopines situation again, but from a different angle this time. Remember how Venice passed a law in 1430 limiting chopines to 3 inches, and remember how women completely ignored it? Well, it's not just that they ignored it. They escalated. By the late 1500s, some Venetian women were wearing chopines that were 18, 20, even 24 inches tall. These weren't subtle violations. These weren't women trying to sneak past the law. These were women making statements. A woman walking around Venice on 2-foot-tall platforms, requiring 2 servants to keep her upright, was impossible to miss. She was a spectacle, and that was the point. She was saying, I don't care about your law, I will be visible, I will be elevated, you can't stop me. And Venetian authorities kind of couldn't stop them. They'd issue new proclamations. They'd threaten fines. They'd warn about the dangers, the injuries, the falls, the miscarriages, and women kept wearing the chopines. Eventually, the government tried a different approach. They started specifically citing the health dangers in their proclamations, hoping that fear would accomplish what fines couldn't. They documented cases of women who'd fallen and lost pregnancies. They made the risks public and explicit. And still, women kept wearing them, because at a certain point, the chopines weren't just about fashion, they were about autonomy, about refusing to be controlled, about asserting that your body, your choices, your appearance belong to you, not to the government, not to your father or husband, not to society. The chopines became symbols of female resistance, dangerous, impractical, economically wasteful symbols, but symbols nonetheless. Now, let's talk about a different type of resistance. The loophole exploiters. These are people who technically followed the law while completely violating its spirit. We touched on this earlier with tailors who would switch from vertical stripes to horizontal stripes when vertical was banned. But there were so many other creative workarounds. One of my favourites involves the regulation of sleeve length. In some Italian cities, there were laws about how long your sleeves could be. Excessively long sleeves that dragged on the ground were seen as wasteful and pretentious, so they were banned. What did fashionable people do? They started wearing detachable sleeves. The main garment would have normal length sleeves that were legal, but then you could attach these long, elaborate, decorative sleeves for special occasions. When officials came around, you'd just detach the illegal parts. Instant compliance. It's like having a car with an illegally loud exhaust system that you can quickly swap out when you see a cop. The spirit of the law is being violated constantly, but the letter of the law is technically followed when it needs to be. Or consider the restrictions on jewellery. Many cities had rules about how many rings you could wear, how many necklaces, how elaborate they could be. So people started sewing jewels directly onto their clothing. Not jewellery, decoration. Completely different category. Totally legal. The officials would see someone covered in gems and have to grudgingly admit that technically these weren't forbidden jewellery pieces. They were fabric embellishments, which were regulated differently if at all. The creativity is admirable. These people were basically fashion lawyers, finding every possible loophole and exploiting it ruthlessly. But there's another group we need to talk about. The ones who resisted not through defiance or cleverness, but through our social pressure and collective action. In Florence, there is a famous case from 1427. New sumptuary laws had been passed, and the government needed citizens to serve on enforcement boards. These boards would review cases, determine penalties and oversee compliance. Nobody wanted to do it. The government tried to appoint people and those people refused. They tried to recruit volunteers. Nobody volunteered. They tried to reassign existing government officials. Those officials protested. Why? Because enforcement made you unpopular. If you served on a sumptuary enforcement board, you were the person fining your neighbours, confiscating your friends' clothing, making enemies of people you had to live alongside in a small city. It was social suicide, so nobody wanted the job. Eventually, the government had to essentially force people to serve by making it a mandatory civic duty like jury duty. And even then, the enforcement was half-hearted. Board members would find technical reasons to dismiss cases. They'd issue minimum fines. They'd warn people privately before filing official charges. The system was being sabotaged from within by the very people appointed to enforce it. This is collective resistance. This is a community saying, we're not going to police each other over clothing. We're not going to participate in this system. You can write all the laws you want, but if we refuse to enforce them, they're meaningless. And then there are the bribes. Oh, the bribes. Because of course there were bribes. When you create a system where minor infractions can result in significant fines, and where enforcement is subjective and depends on officials' judgment, you create a perfect environment for corruption. We know from various historical records that bribery was common. Sometimes it was explicit, paying an official to overlook a violation. Sometimes it was more subtle, officials who were more lenient toward people who'd done favours for them or their families. There are account books that show suspicious payments to officials around the same time as fashion violations. There are letters referencing arrangements made to avoid sumptuary penalties. There are legal cases involving officials who were caught accepting bribes. The system was rotten, and everyone knew it, which made the laws even more illegitimate in people's eyes. If rich people could buy their way out of consequences, what was the point of the laws? If enforcement was arbitrary and corruptible, why respect it? The more corruption existed, the less moral authority the laws had, and the less moral authority they had, the more people felt justified in violating them. It's a downward spiral. And it was largely self-inflicted by the governments that created these unenforceable, petty, invasive laws in the first place. Now, let's return to those persistent offenders for a moment, because I want you to understand what it meant to be caught 5 times like a Salvaggio was. Each time you were caught, your name went into official records. This wasn't anonymous. This was public. Your neighbours knew. Your business associates knew. Your family knew. You were marked as a lawbreaker. In a society that valued reputation intensely, this was supposed to be humiliating, shaming. It was supposed to pressure you into compliance through social stigma. But for people like Salvaggio, something interesting happened. The repeated violations became their own kind of status symbol. Yes, I break the law regularly, and I pay the fines because I can afford to, because the fines are nothing compared to the cost of the clothes themselves. Look at me. I'm wealthy enough to wear illegal clothing and pay the penalties without it mattering. I'm important enough that I don't need to follow your petty rules. I'm fashionable enough that I'd rather be stylish and criminal than legal and dowdy. It was a flex, an expensive, risky, reputation-damaging flex, but a flex nonetheless. And you know what? It worked. Because historians studying this period note that many of these repeat offenders were successful merchants and professionals. Their violations didn't destroy their careers. If anything, their willingness to break fashion laws may have enhanced their reputations as bold, wealthy, fashionable people who couldn't be controlled. There's something deeply important happening here that we need to recognize. These fashion rebels, from Salvaggio with his 5th offence to Venetian women on their illegal chopines to the Florentine citizens refusing to serve on enforcement boards, they were changing the culture. Each violation normalized violation. Each person who broke the law made it slightly easier for the next person to break it. Each enforcement failure made officials slightly less credible. Each act of resistance chipped away at the system. This is how oppressive laws die. Not usually through dramatic revolution, not through governments suddenly seeing the error of their ways, but through collective, persistent, exhausting resistance, through people saying no, and saying no, and saying no, until the system can't sustain itself anymore. The fashion laws didn't end because authorities decided they were unjust. They ended because they became unenforceable, because too many people were violating them. Because enforcement was too expensive, too unpopular, too corrupt, too futile, the rebels won, not through dramatic confrontation but through persistent, annoying, relentless refusal to comply. And there's something beautiful about the fact that this happened through clothing, through something that seems trivial, through fashion, because it shows that resistance doesn't always look revolutionary. It doesn't always involve grand gestures or dramatic speeches. Sometimes resistance is just wearing what you want, walking down the street in your favourite outfit even though it's technically illegal, putting on your tall shoes even though they're forbidden, sewing on an extra button even though you're not supposed to. Small acts, personal acts, acts that say, "This is my body, my life, my choice. You don't get to control this part of me." And when thousands of people make those small choices, when resistance becomes collective even if it's not coordinated, the small acts add up to something revolutionary. The fashion rebels of the Renaissance weren't trying to overthrow the government. They weren't making political statements, at least not consciously. They just wanted to wear nice clothes. They wanted to look good. They wanted to express themselves. But in a system that tried to control every aspect of appearance, that simple desire became radical. Wanting autonomy over your own body became rebellion. Insisting on beauty became resistance, and collectively over decades that resistance succeeded. The laws crumbled, the system fell apart, the rebels wore what they wanted. Of course, we should be honest about who could afford to rebel. Salvaggio could pay his fines because he had money. Venetian women on tall chopines could risk injury because they had servants to catch them if they fell. The people exploiting loopholes could afford the expensive alternative versions of things. The poorest people, the ones with the least resources, they couldn't rebel as easily. They couldn't afford the fines. They couldn't risk losing their livelihoods. They had to comply because non-compliance came with costs they couldn't bear. So this story of resistance is also a story about privilege, about how having resources gives you the freedom to fight back in ways that poor people can't access. That's worth acknowledging, worth being honest about. Because the fashion rebels we celebrate were often the wealthy. Their rebellion was enabled by their money. And while their resistance helped break down the system for everyone, they were never facing the same risks as someone without resources. But that doesn't make their resistance meaningless. It just makes it complicated, like most resistance is. By the early 1600s, the system was clearly dying. England officially repealed its sumptuary laws in 1603. Other countries followed gradually. The laws remained on the books in some places for a while longer, but enforcement became rare. Officials stopped caring. People stopped complying. The whole apparatus just sort of dissolved. Why? Lots of reasons. Economic changes, the rise of the middle class making the old hierarchies obsolete, the Protestant Reformation changing attitudes about luxury and display, the practical impossibility of enforcement, but also simply exhaustion. Authorities were tired of fighting a battle they couldn't win. Citizens were tired of pretending to comply with laws they found ridiculous. Everyone was ready to move on. And what happened when the laws ended? Did society collapse? Did chaos reign? Did the visual markers of status disappearing cause mass confusion and social breakdown? No, of course not. People kept dressing according to their means and their tastes. Social hierarchies persisted through other mechanisms. Life went on. The thing the authorities were so afraid of, the thing they'd spent centuries trying to prevent through thousands of detailed regulations, turned out to be survivable, turned out to be fine, turned out to be maybe even better than the alternative. Freedom in fashion didn't destroy society. It just changed it, made it slightly more flexible, slightly more open, slightly more focused on who you were rather than what you wore. And that brings us to maybe the most important question we've been circling this entire time. The question underneath all these stories about colours and codpieces and chopines and fabric and poison and money and rebellion. Why did the laws fail? What does that failure mean? What did Renaissance people learn from this centuries-long experiment in controlling appearance, and what should we learn from it now? Because here's the thing, the fashion laws are gone, but the impulse behind them isn't. We're still policing what people wear. We're still judging people by their appearance. We're still trying to control bodies and choices through rules about clothing. The methods have changed. The underlying logic hasn't. And if we're going to understand why Renaissance sumptuary laws ultimately failed, why they couldn't hold in the face of human desire for self-expression, then maybe we can understand something about the dress codes and beauty standards and fashion pressures we live with today. So let's bring this home. Let's talk about what all of this means. What these stories from 500 years ago can teach us about freedom, about control, about fashion, about being human. Let's talk about the lessons, the real practical, applicable lessons that Renaissance fashion failures offer us now. William Prynne was angry. It's London, 1633, and this English lawyer and pamphleteer is so furious about what people are wearing that he's writing hundreds of pages about it. His particular target, foreign fashion. He writes, and I'm paraphrasing slightly but the sentiment is exact, that English people are abandoning their native dress for the fashions of other countries. French styles, Italian styles, Spanish styles. And this isn't just a matter of taste to Prynne. This is a national emergency, a moral catastrophe, a threat to English identity itself. Foreign fashion, he argues, is corrupting English character, making English people less English, weakening the nation from within through fancy imported clothing. He calls for laws, strict laws, laws that would force English people to dress English, to reject foreign influence, to prove their patriotism through their wardrobes. And here's the fascinating thing. Prynne isn't alone. Across Renaissance Europe, in every country, there are people making the exact same argument. The French are worried about Italian influence. The Italians are worried about Spanish influence. Everyone is convinced that foreign fashion is a threat to national identity, to cultural purity, to the very fabric of society. Foreign clothes weren't just clothes. They were invasions, contaminations, betrayals. And governments tried to legislate against them with the same fervour they brought to controlling every other aspect of fashion. Welcome to the nationalism of fashion, where what you wore didn't just say something about your class or your wealth. It said something about your loyalty, your patriotness, your very identity as a member of your nation. Let's start with the basic economics of foreign fashion, because that's always underlying these concerns. We talked before about how sumptuary laws were partly justified as protecting domestic industry, but there was a specific fear about foreign goods that went beyond general protectionism. When you bought silk from Italy or velvet from Spain or lace from Flanders, you were sending money out of your country. Money that could have circulated in the domestic economy was instead enriching foreign merchants, foreign artisans, foreign nations. In the mercantilist thinking of the Renaissance, this was seen as weakening your country and strengthening your rivals. Every florin spent on imported fabric was a florin that could have gone to English weavers, French tailors, German dyers. It was economic warfare and you were arming the enemy. England was particularly obsessed with this. Remember, they had a massive wool industry that was crucial to their economy. English wool was famous across Europe. It was exported everywhere. So when wealthy English people started buying imported silk and velvet instead of wearing English wool, the government panicked. They weren't just violating social hierarchy, they were betraying English economic interests. They were choosing foreign luxury over domestic prosperity. They were, in a sense, being unpatriotic through their fashion choices. And this economic argument got mixed up with cultural arguments about identity and belonging in ways that became deeply emotional and irrational. Let me tell you about Queen Elizabeth I's proclamation from 1562, because it's a perfect example of how specific these clothing nationalism laws could get. The proclamation lists, in exhaustive detail, exactly what fabrics people of different ranks can wear. But woven throughout are constant references to the origin of materials. Cloth of gold tissue, forbidden unless you're royalty. Purple silk, forbidden unless you're nobility. But there are also restrictions on foreign fabrics specifically. The language makes it clear that English-made cloth is preferable to imported cloth at every level. If you must wear silk, English-made silk is better than Italian silk. If you must have velvet, English velvet is better than Spanish velvet. And the proclamation includes this phrase that I find telling. It aims to prevent the inordinate excess of apparel, but also to defend the realm by encouraging domestic production and limiting imports. Defend the realm. Defend. Fashion is framed as a matter of national defence. What you choose to wear is positioned as a choice between supporting your country and supporting foreign interests. Buying an Italian silk dress isn't just a purchase, it's picking a side. The rhetoric is deliberately militaristic. And it worked. It made people feel guilty about their foreign fashion choices. It made buying domestic cloth feel like patriotic duty. But here's the irony that makes this whole situation almost comically absurd. Most of the native fashions that countries were trying to protect and promote, they originated somewhere else. Take the chopine. We talked about how these platform shoes became quintessentially Venetian, a symbol of Venice, so distinctively Venetian that Shakespeare references them and everyone knows what he means. But chopines weren't invented in Venice. They came from Turkey, or possibly China, or maybe Greece. Historians debate the exact origin, but everyone agrees they were imported to Venice through trade routes and then adapted. So when Venice tried to regulate chopines as part of their fashion culture, they were regulating an import that had become naturalized. The Venetian fashion was foreign in origin. Or consider the codpiece, that most European of Renaissance fashions. Where did it come from? Nobody's entirely sure. It seems to have originated as a practical solution to a wardrobe problem, but the decorative excess it evolved into had influences from multiple countries. Spanish courtiers wore elaborate codpieces, French noblemen wore them, German knights wore them, English kings wore them. Was it English, French, Spanish? It was all of them. Fashion crosses borders, it always has. And that's the thing about trying to create nationalistic fashion. Fashion is inherently international. Ideas spread, styles are copied, merchants trade, people travel. A fashion that starts in Italy spreads to France, then to England, then back to Italy in a modified form. Trying to contain fashion within national boundaries is like trying to contain water with a net. But governments tried anyway, and the ways they tried reveal fascinating anxieties about national identity. In Scotland, there was a law, and this is remarkable, that banned specific foreign clothing items. You couldn't wear French-style gowns, you couldn't wear Milan-style caps. The law actually specified national origins of fashion items and forbade them. Can you imagine enforcing this? An official stopping you on the street and examining your cap. Is this a Milan-style cap or a Scottish cap? The brim suggests Italian influence. I'm going to need you to prove this was made in Scotland. How do you even determine the national origin of a fashion style? Fashion evolves through influence and imitation. A Scottish tailor sees a French gown, likes the sleeve design, incorporates it into a Scottish dress. Is that now a French dress? A Scottish dress with French influence? A hybrid? The categories are impossible to maintain. But the law tried to maintain them anyway because the idea of national fashion identity was so important to how people thought about who they were. And this connects to something deeper about Renaissance nationalism, because these countries, England, France, Spain, Scotland, the Italian city-states, they were still figuring out what it meant to be a nation, what tied people together beyond just living in the same geographic area, under the same ruler. Language was one answer, religion was another, but culture and fashion is culture, that was huge. If everyone in England dressed like English people, that created a visual unity, a sense of shared identity. It made the nation feel real in a way that abstract political boundaries didn't. So when the people started wearing foreign fashions, it threatened that visual unity. It made the nation less legible, less cohesive. It suggested that maybe people's loyalty was to fashion rather than to country. And for authorities trying to build national identity, this was terrifying. They needed visible symbols of Englishness, Frenchness, Spanishness. They needed people to look at each other and instantly recognize that person is one of us. That person belongs to our nation. Foreign fashion disrupted that recognition, and so it had to be controlled. There's a historian named Rose Hentergel who writes about this in the context of England. She argues that clothing helped to create sentiments of nationhood through the linkage of clothing with a particular country. In other words, fashion wasn't just reflecting national identity, it was creating it. By associating certain styles with certain nations, and by encouraging people to wear those national styles, authorities were literally building nationalism through clothing. And when people rejected those national styles in favour of foreign fashions, they were undermining that nation-building project. They were saying through their clothes that their identity wasn't primarily national, that they had other loyalties, other allegiances, other sources of belonging. This is why the reaction to foreign fashion was so intense. It wasn't really about the clothes, it was about what the clothes represented, about whether national identity could be imposed from above, or whether it would emerge from people's actual choices and desires. And the evidence suggests that people's choices won. Foreign fashions kept being adopted. Cross-cultural influence kept happening. The borders were porous and fashion flowed across them no matter how many laws tried to stop it. Let me share a specific example of how ridiculous this foreign fashion panic could get. In France, there was a period in the late 1500s when Italian fashion was hugely influential. French nobles were wearing Italian styles, hiring Italian tailors, copying Italian trends. French authorities freaked out. They issued proclamations against Italian fashion. They encouraged French tailors. They tried to create distinctly French alternatives to Italian styles. But here's the thing. At the exact same time, in Italy, there was panic about Spanish fashion influencing Italian dress. Italians were worried that Spanish styles were corrupting Italian fashion identity, and in Spain, they were worried about French influence. Everyone was worried about everyone else. Every country thought their fashion was under attack from foreign influence. Every country thought their unique identity was being eroded by imports. But from the outside, looking at this historical moment, you can see that fashion was just circulating. Ideas were spreading, styles were evolving, people across Europe were influencing each other, creating new hybrids, pushing fashion forward through cross-pollination. The panic was about preserving something that had never been pure in the first place. Fashion had always been international. The idea of national fashion styles was largely invented, created retroactively to give countries something to defend. And then there's the class dimension to all of this, because of course there is. Foreign fashion wasn't just a national identity issue. It was a class issue disguised as a national identity issue. Who could afford imported fabrics? The wealthy. Who could hire foreign tailors? The aristocracy who travelled abroad and brought back fashion ideas. The elite. So when governments railed against foreign fashion, they were partly railing against upper-class cosmopolitanism, against the reality that wealthy people had more in common with wealthy people in other countries than they did with poor people in their own country. A French nobleman and an Italian nobleman might dress similarly, speak similar languages, share similar cultural references. They had more shared identity than that French nobleman had with a French peasant. Their class transcended their nationality. And for governments trying to build national unity, this was a problem. How do you create loyalty to the nation when the elite don't feel primarily national? When their allegiances are to their class, their international networks, their cosmopolitan culture, you try to force visible nationalism. You try to make them dress like their country. You try to create laws that bind them to national identity, whether they want to be bound or not. It didn't work. The elite kept dressing cosmopolitically, but the attempt reveals the anxieties underneath. The fear that maybe the nation was a fiction, that maybe people's real identities and loyalties didn't align with political boundaries. There's something that historian Anna Bryson notes that I think is really important. She writes that there was sufficient common ground among European elites for judgments and counter-judgments on the civility of other nations to be made everywhere in remarkably similar terms. In other words, despite all the national distinctiveness rhetoric, European elites basically shared a culture. They were judging each other using the same standards of civility, fashion, behaviour. The differences between nations were smaller than the similarities among the elite across nations, which means the foreign fashion panic was partly about maintaining distinctions that were already pretty blurry. It was about insisting on difference in the face of increasing homogeneity, about protecting borders that were already culturally permeable. And fashion, visible and public, became the battleground where this anxiety played out. If we can't make people think differently or believe differently, if European elites are going to share values and aesthetics, at least we can make them dress differently. At least we can have that. But even that didn't work, because people kept choosing cosmopolitan fashion over national fashion. They kept valuing style over patriotism. They kept proving that fashion loyalty was stronger than national loyalty. Eventually, as with everything else we've discussed, the foreign fashion laws became unenforceable and faded away. Trade continued. Fashion continued to circulate. National boundaries remained porous to cultural influence. And what happened? Did nations lose their identity? Did everyone become indistinguishable? Did the fears come true? Not really. Nations developed identities in other ways. Through language policy, education, shared history, political institutions, fashion became less central to national identity as other mechanisms took over. People still wore different styles in different places, but those differences were based on available materials, local climate, regional traditions, not legal mandates. Fashion nationalism didn't disappear, but it stopped being enforced by law and started being a matter of cultural preference. Which is healthier, honestly? Cultural identity that emerges organically from shared experience is more robust than identity imposed through legislation. When people choose to dress a certain way because it feels right to them, that means something. When they're forced to dress that way under threat of punishment, it means nothing. And yet, the impulse behind Renaissance fashion nationalism is still with us, isn't it? We still have anxieties about foreign influence. We still tie national identity to consumption choices. We still judge people's loyalty based on what they buy and where it comes from. Buy American, buy British, support local. These aren't laws anymore, but they're powerful social messages, and they're based on the same logic as Renaissance sumptuary laws, that your purchasing choices reflect your national loyalty. That buying foreign goods is somehow betraying your country. We've made it optional rather than mandatory, but the guilt is still there. The sense that you should prefer domestic products, that choosing foreign goods needs justification. And in fashion particularly, we still have these conversations about cultural appropriation, about who has the right to wear what, about whether adopting styles from other cultures is appreciation or theft. The questions have changed, but they're rooted in similar anxieties about cultural boundaries, authenticity, and belonging. I'm not saying these modern concerns are the same as Renaissance fashion nationalism. The power dynamics are different. The history is different. The stakes are different. But there's a thread connecting them. A persistent human anxiety about culture crossing borders, about identity being diluted, about losing something essential when styles are shared. Maybe what Renaissance fashion nationalism teaches us is that you can't legislate culture. You can't force identity. You can't make people feel national loyalty by controlling what they wear. Culture is alive. It moves. It changes. It crosses borders. It hybridizes. And trying to freeze it in place, to keep it pure, to maintain distinctions through law, that doesn't work. It never worked. People find ways around it. They resist. They choose cosmopolitan over local, style over patriotism, personal preference over prescribed identity, and eventually the laws have to give up. Because culture is stronger than legislation, human desire for beauty and self-expression is stronger than nationalist anxiety. Connection across borders is stronger than attempts to reinforce those borders. Renaissance fashion nationalism failed. All those laws, all that rhetoric, all those attempts to make clothing a measure of patriotism, they couldn't hold against the simple human reality that fashion is international, has always been international, will always be international. And maybe that's okay, maybe that's even good. Maybe the lesson is that our identities are more complex than any nation, that our connections transcend borders, that trying to contain culture is like trying to contain water. The fashion flows. It always has. It always will. And that's not a threat to identity. It's an expression of our shared humanity. So we've reached the end of our journey through Renaissance fashion laws. We've covered so much ground, from Salvaggio arrested 5 times in his illegal silk to purple dye worth more than gold, from codpieces stuffed with syphilis medicine to chopines causing miscarriages, from tailors imprisoned for sewing velvet to women poisoning themselves with lead makeup, from merchants bankrupting their families for fancy clothes to rebels who refused to comply until the whole system collapsed, from the fear of foreign fashion threatening national identity to the reality that fashion has always crossed borders. All of these stories, all of these laws, all of this control and resistance, they add up to something. They tell us something important about power, freedom, identity, and being human. And as we come to the end of this long night together, I want to bring it all home. I want to talk about what this history means, what these Renaissance people learned through centuries of fashion warfare, what their failures and successes can teach us about our own time, our own struggles, our own relationship with clothing and control and freedom. So let's close this out. Let's talk about the big lessons. Let's make sense of why we've spent hours together exploring the funny, tragic, absurd, inspiring history of Renaissance fashion laws. The year is 1598. Somewhere in England, a tailor is making what will turn out to be one of the last fashionable codpieces. He doesn't know it's one of the last. He's just following the style. But fashion is changing. The massive, ostentatious codpiece that defined masculine fashion for nearly a century is dying. Within a few years, it'll be gone completely. What replaced it? The peace-god belly, a padded stomach. Men stopped emphasizing their groins and started padding their bellies instead, creating this weird rounded silhouette that made them look perpetually well-fed. Because apparently men just needed to pad something. The location changed, but the impulse remained. But here's what's significant. When the codpiece died, it died completely. There was no nostalgia for it, no revival, no vintage codpiece movement. Unlike other fashions that cycle back, platform shoes, wide leg pants, crop tops, the codpiece stayed dead. Why? I think because on some collective level, European men looked back at the century they'd spent walking around with giant decorative bulges strapped to their crotches and thought, yeah, that was too much. That was us taking something too far. Let's not do that again. They learned. And that learning, that collective cultural realization that some fashions are mistakes, that's actually really important. Because it shows that societies can change, can evolve, can look back at their choices and decide to make different ones. So let's talk about what changed. Why did the fashion laws ultimately fail? Why did this massive system of control, enforced for centuries across multiple countries, eventually collapse? The easy answer is that enforcement became impossible. Too many people were violating the laws. The middle class was too wealthy. Trade was too extensive. The system couldn't sustain itself. And that's true. But I think there's something deeper happening. Something about what people learn through the experience of living under these laws. They learn that controlling appearance doesn't actually control identity. You can force someone to wear wool instead of silk, but you can't force them to accept their social position. You can fine someone for wearing purple, but you can't make them feel less worthy than someone wearing purple legally. You can regulate every detail of their clothing, but you can't regulate their sense of self. The laws tried to make the external reflect the internal, to make clothing determine identity, to make what you wore define who you were, but people kept insisting on the opposite. Kept asserting that who they were transcended what they wore, that their worth wasn't visible, that their identity was internal, not external. And eventually that insistence won, not through revolution, not through dramatic protest, but through persistent, exhausting, relentless refusal to believe what the laws were trying to tell them. Here's what I find most moving about this whole history. Every person we've talked about, Salvaggio in his illegal silk, the Venetian women on their dangerous chopines, the tailors who found loopholes, the officials who refused to enforce, they were fighting for something fundamental. They were fighting for the right to say, I am more than what you see, I am more than my appearance, I am more than my social rank. I define myself, not you, not the government, not the church, not society. Mia, that's revolutionary, that's radical, even if it's expressed through something as seemingly trivial as wearing the wrong colour, or the wrong fabric, or the wrong height of shoe. Because fashion is never just fashion. Clothing is never just clothing. What we wear is how we present ourselves to the world. It's how we communicate who we are, who we want to be, what we value. When someone tries to control what you wear, they're trying to control how you're seen, how you're understood, how you're allowed to exist in public space. The Renaissance sumptuary laws were about controlling existence, about saying you can only exist in these specific ways. You can only be visible in these prescribed forms. You can only take up this much space, wear this much beauty, express this much self. And people said no, in big ways and small ways, in extensive ways and creative ways. They said no until the laws couldn't hold anymore. Now let me be honest about something. The laws died, but the systems they represented didn't. Not completely. We don't have legal sumptuary laws anymore. Nobody's going to arrest you for wearing purple or silk or too many buttons. But we still police clothing. We still judge people by their appearance. We still have dress codes that regulate bodies, especially women's bodies, especially bodies that don't conform to narrow standards. School dress codes that disproportionately target girls. Workplace dress codes that enforce gender norms. Social pressure that says certain bodies shouldn't wear certain styles. Economic realities that make fashionable clothing accessible only to those with money. Beauty standards that still poison people just with different chemicals. The Renaissance laws were explicit. They were written down. You could read them and know exactly what was forbidden. Modern fashion policing is implicit. It's social pressure, economic barriers, internalized shame. In some ways, that makes it harder to fight. Because how do you resist a rule that's never quite stated? How do you challenge a law that doesn't officially exist? But the Renaissance teaches us that resistance is possible, that persistent refusal works, that systems of control, no matter how entrenched, can crumble when enough people stop complying. Salvaggio was caught 5 times, and he kept wearing his silk until they stopped catching him, until they gave up, until the system admitted defeat. What did Renaissance people learn? What's the lesson that eventually sank in after centuries of fashion warfare? I think it's this. You can't legislate taste. You can't enforce style. You can't make people value what you think they should value. And you definitely can't stop people from expressing themselves through appearance. Fashion is creative. It's adaptive. It's relentlessly innovative. Every time you ban something, people find an alternative. Every time you restrict one thing, they emphasize something else. Every time you try to control them, they find new ways to express themselves. The codpiece was controlled, so men padded their stomachs. Vertical stripes were banned, so tailors created horizontal stripes. Long sleeves were forbidden, so people made detachable sleeves. Pearls were limited, so people sewed jewels on fabric. On and on. Resistance. Endless adaptation. You can't stop fashion. You can only push it in new directions. And eventually authorities realized this. Realized that the battle was futile, that people would always find ways to express themselves. That controlling appearance was like trying to control thought. Technically possible in specific moments, but ultimately unsustainable, so they gave up. The laws were repealed, and fashion moved forward, unrestricted, into new absurdities and beauties and expression. There's a quote I keep thinking about. It's from a historian named Lorraine Daston, and she says that sumptuary laws furnish the historian of rules with an extreme case of rule failure. Rule failure. These laws were failures. They didn't achieve their goals. They didn't maintain social hierarchies. The hierarchies shifted anyway. They didn't prevent excess. People found ways to be excessive within or around the laws. They didn't protect morality. Morality isn't determined by hemlines. They didn't strengthen national identity. Identity emerged from other sources. Every goal the laws aimed for, they failed to achieve, and that failure is instructive, because it shows us what doesn't work, what kinds of control are doomed from the start, what battles aren't worth fighting because they can't be won. You can't control human creativity. You can't suppress the desire for beauty. You can't eliminate the need for self-expression. You can't make people small, invisible, compliant through dress codes and fashion laws. People will always push back, will always find ways to be themselves, will always insist on their right to exist in their own bodies, in their own clothes, on their own terms. The Renaissance proved this, definitively, exhaustively, through centuries of trying and failing to do the opposite. So what do we take from this? What does this history mean for us now, 500 years later? Living in a world without codpieces or chopines or lead makeup or legal restrictions on purple? I think it means we need to be suspicious of dress codes, of beauty standards, of any system that tries to tell us how our bodies should look, how we should present ourselves. What's acceptable for us to wear? Not all dress codes are evil. Some are practical, some are protective, some even make sense in specific contexts. But we should always ask, who benefits from this restriction? Who's being controlled? Whose bodies are being regulated? Whose self-expression is being limited? And if the answer is that it's controlling marginalized people or women, or anyone who doesn't fit narrow norms, then we should question it, push back against it, refuse to comply with it, just like Renaissance people did. Because the lesson of Renaissance fashion laws is that resistance works, slowly, exhaustingly, but it works. When enough people say no, when enough people insist on their right to exist as they choose, the systems have to change, the laws have to adapt, the restrictions have to loosen. It took centuries in the Renaissance. Maybe it won't take as long for us. Maybe we've learned something about the futility of controlling bodies and appearance. Maybe we can move faster toward freedom. And freedom is what this is really about. All these stories, all these absurd, tragic, inspiring, ridiculous stories about codpieces and chopines and purple and poison, they're all stories about freedom, about the human drive to be free, to choose, to express, to exist without permission. The Renaissance fashion rebels weren't trying to start a revolution. They were just trying to wear nice clothes. But in a system that tried to control everything, wearing nice clothes became revolutionary. Insisting on beauty became resistance. Choosing for yourself became freedom. And that's still true. Every time you wear something that makes you feel good, that expresses who you are, that defies narrow standards, you're participating in that same resistance. You're asserting that same freedom. You're continuing that same fight. The Renaissance fashion laws are dead. But the spirit that killed them, the relentless human insistence on self-expression, on beauty, on choice, that's alive. That's in all of us. That's what makes us human. We want to be beautiful. We want to express ourselves. We want to choose how we're seen. And no law, no restriction, no system of control can eliminate that want. It's too fundamental, too essential, too deeply woven into who we are. So here we are at the end of our journey. We started with Salvaggio being arrested for the 5th time in 1595. We've travelled through 500 years of fashion warfare. We've met rebels and enforcers, victims and survivors, people who fought and people who gave up, systems that tried to control and people who refused to be controlled. And what we've found is something hopeful, I think. We've found that freedom wins, not easily, not quickly, not without cost, but eventually, persistently, exhaustingly, freedom wins. The Renaissance spent centuries trying to control fashion, and fashion won. People won. The desire for self-expression, for beauty, for choice, that won. And if that can win against centuries of legal control, against governments and churches and social pressure, against fines and imprisonment and social shame, then maybe it can win against whatever tries to control us now. Maybe we can take inspiration from Salvaggio, arrested 5 times and still wearing his silk, from Venetian women falling off their chopines and climbing back on, from tailors finding loopholes, from officials refusing to enforce, from everyone who said no in whatever way they could, until no became the norm. Maybe we can carry that spirit forward, that refusal to be controlled, that insistence on freedom, that belief that we define ourselves, not through what we're allowed to wear, but through what we choose to wear. You know, when I started researching this topic, I expected it to be funny. And it is funny. Codpieces and 20-inch platform shoes and officials counting buttons are objectively funny. But it's also sad and inspiring and infuriating and hopeful, all at once, because these aren't just stories about weird old fashion, they're stories about us, about human nature, about what we fight for and what we're willing to sacrifice, about how we resist and how we survive, about the eternal tension between control and freedom, conformity and expression, staying in our place and insisting on something more. These Renaissance people, they were just trying to live their lives, trying to look good, trying to express themselves, trying to be free, and their struggle is our struggle, their fight is our fight. Centuries apart, but the same battle, the same stakes, The same fundamental question: who gets to decide how we exist in the world? And the Renaissance answer, learned through painful experience, is we do. We decide. Not perfectly, not without constraints, but ultimately we decide. And no system can take that from us permanently. We keep insisting, keep pushing back, keep choosing ourselves until the systems can't hold anymore. That's the lesson. That's what Renaissance fashion laws teach us. That freedom is possible, that resistance works, that we are more powerful than we think, that our choices matter, that our insistence on being ourselves, that matters too. So thank you. Thank you for staying with me through this long, strange journey through Renaissance fashion history. Thank you for caring about codpieces and chopines and people who've been dead for 500 years but who still have something to teach us. Thank you for spending these hours with me, exploring these stories, thinking about what they mean. I hope you found something valuable here, something interesting, something that makes you think differently about fashion, about control, about freedom, about history, about being human. And I hope you'll carry these stories with you. Remember Salvaggio when someone tries to tell you what you can't wear. Remember the Venetian women when someone says you're taking up too much space. Remember the tailors finding loopholes when someone says the rules can't be changed. Remember the Renaissance rebels when you need courage to be yourself. Their fight isn't over. We're still fighting it. And knowing they fought it too and eventually won, that matters. That gives us hope. That shows us it's possible. So wear what makes you happy. Express yourself however you want. Take up space. Be visible. Be beautiful on your own terms. And when someone tries to control you, remember, they tried to control Renaissance people for centuries, and the Renaissance people won. You can win too. Until next time, take care of yourselves, rest well, dream beautifully. And remember, you're more than what anyone sees. You define yourself, always have, always will. Good night.